Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's study session of the Boulder City Council. I'm Mayor Pro Tem Folkerts, and I want to thank you all for joining us. On tonight's agenda, we have 3 items. Our first will be the Vision Zero Action Plan and Signal Practices Update. Our second will be Waterwise Landscaping and Wildfire Hardening Updates, which is sort of 2 different items. And our third is a discussion to reaffirm Council's commitment to Council rules of procedure. Before we go into our work, I'm going to outline how the meeting will be conducted. We will review the staff's presentation and then have time for questions. And after that, we will give our comments. I would like to now turn it over to City Manager Nuria Rivera-Vandermide to introduce our first item.
Thank you so much, Mayor Pro Tem Folkerts. Our first item actually is something that has been worked on for quite a while and came up at your last retreat. We were talking a little bit about the work that our transportation and mobility team had already been planning and been working on in terms of the traffic signal practices manual and some updates there. It had been of interest to Council. And so today we're going to be discussing that a little bit and sort of hoping to get a little bit of feedback and your comments on some of the work that is anticipated ahead. So with that, I will pass it to our principal traffic engineer, Devin Joslin, who will take us through it. Sorry, Devin.
No problem. Thank you, Nuria. And I believe the clerk's office is going to have the presentation up. Thank you. Well, good evening, Mayor Brockett and members of council. As Nuria said, my name is Devin Joslin. I'm the city's principal traffic engineer. The purpose of tonight's presentation is to orient you to the signal timing practices and how they are planned to be updated in accordance with the actions identified in the Vision Zero Action Plan. The practices are an operational and technical document used internally by city staff to guide decisions related to the planning, design, construction, operations, and maintenance of the traffic signal system, consistent with the authority delegated to the principal traffic engineer as outlined in the Boulder Revised Code. As such, it is anticipated that city staff and a consultant will collaborate to complete the updates. The Transportation Advisory Board and City Council will receive periodic updates as work progresses. Next slide. I'll cover 6 main things tonight, which include an overview of the signal practices, the Vision Zero context related to crashes occurring at signals, the success staff has had implementing the signal practices, the state of the existing signal system, and the items that staff have been considering relative to the scope of work for the signal practices update. Next slide. When engineers within the transportation operations team go about updating internal practices, as will be the case with this update, there are many things we consider to help guide the complex technical and engineering decisions that are required. Some items we consider are highlighted on this slide and include such things as national best practices, industry or peer agency research, technological advancements, crash data trends to inform how to focus our limited resources to get the most return on investment, multimodal data to understand the potential for risk and exposure to conflicts during each signal cycle, and the visibility of users traveling through the intersection. Implementation feasibility to understand the level of complexity or costs associated with making changes. Next slide. In 2018, a signal practices document was developed as an internal technical document for city staff to use to efficiently and consistently make decisions based on established engineering and asset management principles. The action items in the Vision Zero Action Plan related to the signal practices update focus on updates to topics covered within the operations section. This section is what details how the city determines such things as left turn phasing, right turn on red restrictions, and leading pedestrian intervals. And these topic areas are what correspond most closely to the crash types that frequently occur at signals. Next slide. As mentioned, the signal timing practices update is focused on addressing a subset of severe crashes that occur at signalized intersections. Review of the most recent 4 years of severe crash data indicates that 37% of all severe crashes occur at signalized intersections. This equates to about 18 severe crashes per year at signals and 30 severe crashes per year occurring at other locations. Next slide. There are 9 main crash types that resulted in severe crashes during the period from 2020 through 2023, as detailed in the pie chart shown on the slide. There have been an average of just over 8 severe crashes per year attributed to making left turns at signalized intersections, making it the most common crash type. There have been an average of 5 severe crashes per year attributed to red light running, making it the second most common crash type. The remaining 7 crash types at signalized intersections result in a total of approximately 5 severe crashes per year. Note that all severe crashes involving right turn movements result in less than 2 severe crashes per year on average. Specifically, severe crashes resulting from right turns on red are very low citywide at an average of 0.5 severe crashes per year on average. Next slide. Looking again at the overall citywide annual severe crash picture, left turn related crashes at signals currently make up about 17% of all annual severe crashes, 8 out of 48 per year on average. The update to the practices is focused on driving down that number, but you can see that even eliminating all left turn severe crashes would leave a significant amount of work to be done to reach zero. That is why the Transportation and Mobility Department must take a multifaceted engineering and systems-based approach to getting to zero, and why no one single action will get us there. A data-driven approach assures that our limited resources are invested in ways that will be most impactful. Next slide. The ongoing evaluation of before and after crash data since 2012 associated with the strategic implementation of left turn phasing changes shows that there has been a 68% decrease in the total number of left turn crashes at signalized intersections. The progress made since 2012 has been significant and demonstrates that the strategic and focused approach to implementing signal timing and phasing changes has served the community well and been successful. Next slide. Thank you. I will now briefly describe the current state of the overall signal system with respect to the type of left turn phasing or roadway geometry that is present. Across the city, there are a total of 146 traffic signals that control vehicular movements, and there are 494 intersection approaches where the signal controls left turn movements. The key takeaway from this slide is that 48% of the existing signal system does not support quick or easy implementation of left turn phasing changes, be it to protected only all the time or another type of left turn phasing, such as permitted phasing that uses a flashing yellow arrow indication. The work required to make every intersection approach compatible with protected left turn phasing would be quite costly and time-consuming to complete. As noted in the memo, the cost is estimated at a minimum of $12.5 million in today's dollars. The other interesting thing to note from this slide is that currently only 7% of signalized intersection approaches across the system operate with protected only left turn phasing at all times. Despite this, there are very few intersections remaining across the system that have a crash pattern that would be correctable by a change to the type of left turn phasing. Next slide. This slide illustrates one example of the limitations of the signal system or roadway infrastructure that would make implementing changes to protected left turn phasing more broadly across the system challenging. This example shows the eastbound left turn movement at the intersection of Canyon Boulevard and 15th Street. This left turn currently operates with permitted only left turn phasing at all times, as indicated with a circular green ball indication. As you can see, the signal mast arm does not extend over the left turn lane. This means that to implement a different type of left turn phasing, the traffic signal pole and mast arm for this approach would need to be reconstructed to extend the arm over the left turn lane and to make it strong enough to support the additional signal heads needed to indicate the left turn phasing. Next slide. The main topics intended to be updated in the operations section include practices related to left turn phasing, right turn on red, and leading pedestrian intervals, as well as considerations for the installation of accessible pedestrian signals and coordination of pedestrian signals. Many of these topics correspond to Vision Zero Action Plan actions or were identified as priority topics to update from this year's effort to update the pedestrian crossing treatment installation guidelines. As noted, focused and strategic implementation of the current signal practices, particularly those related to left turn phasing, have led to significant crash reduction. Yet crashes involving left turns at signals continue to represent approximately 15 to 20% of severe crashes citywide. Thus, there will be a key focus on updating the practice for left turn phasing, as this remains an area in which the most severe crash reduction can be achieved. Next slide. For each topic area that is planned to be updated, the scope of work will strive to understand the various levers that can be adjusted and the technical considerations, costs, and expected crash reduction impacts of doing so. Items that will be considered in detail are expected to include such things as existing city policy, the need for new practices, a review and assessment of evaluation criteria, a review of trade-offs related to things like cycle lengths, queue lengths, signal coordination, potential changes in travel patterns, and the potential for other crash types to occur as a result of changes made to reduce another crash type. A review of technological advancements, particularly with respect to the various ways in which left turn phasing can be programmed and operated to mitigate conflicts between users, the extent to which geometric or other changes might be feasible, and finally, a prioritization methodology that thoughtfully considers such things as the extent to which the evaluation criteria are met, the cost and staff time to implement, the ability to coordinate enhancements with upcoming projects or maintenance activities, equity-focused indicators, and grant program eligibility. Next slide. There are a number of existing policies that guide the operational practices of our department. The Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan sets the community's core values and long-term vision along with a number of policies. The policies in the transportation section generally reflect the focus areas of the city's TMP and the adopted Boulder County TMP. The BVCP is the umbrella for our departmental plans, like our 2019 TMP, that provides guidance on how to operationalize things like Vision Zero and provides targets for specific measures, like reducing single occupant automobile trips and vehicle miles traveled. The policy related to transportation safety is shown on the slide and states that the city and Boulder County recognize safety for people of all ages using any mode within the transportation system as a fundamental goal. The policy emphasizes the importance of focusing on crash trends and mitigation strategies identified in the Safe Streets Boulder report. Next slide. As we consider the scope of work for this update, we are referencing policy guidance in our TMP, as well as pedestrian plan and low-stress walk and bike network plan. On the screen here, you can see snapshots of how these plans lay out the framework for how we plan to approach this update of our signal practices. In addition to our Vision Zero action plan and high-risk network, these plans detail methodologies that were used to identify pedestrian improvement areas and to focus on intersections and signal timing practices that facilitate multimodal improvement. Next slide. Another key aspect of the scope of work is the deliverables that will be expected to be produced. Anticipated deliverables are envisioned to include such things as updating outdated references to existing policy documents and the current signal practices, documentation of current research and best practices related to relevant topic areas, revised evaluation criteria, revised decision-making flowcharts and matrices, tabulation of intersection approaches where changes to left turn phasing, leading pedestrian intervals, and no right turn on red are recommended, development of a prioritization methodology, and cost estimates to understand the implementation schedule and total cost of unfunded needs. Next slide. The takeaways are that continuing to understand crash causes and corresponding countermeasures is key to determining how lower cost engineering solutions that separate users and time can balance many trade-offs and have a positive impact on achieving Vision Zero. Next slide. Following tonight's discussion with City Council, staff plans to begin a process early next year to select a consultant to assist with this work. At that point, we would negotiate with the consultant to finalize the scope of work, schedule, and budget, being sure to consider TAB and council feedback received. As work progresses, staff will provide TAB and council with periodic progress updates with the goal of completing the practices update by late Q3 2025. Toward the end of next year, work would begin to implement low-cost changes, such as reprogramming of left turn phasing at high-risk network intersections where recommended. Next slide. This concludes the presentation, and I look forward to hearing your feedback and answering your questions. And it looks like the questions have been posted in the chat for reference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Let's see, it looks like we have Ryan ready to kick us off with questions.
Thank you, Devin, to you and the team. Just one question, Lauren. I assume I'll just I'll do the first question, and then I'm not going to do all three at this point. I'm just going to take the first question. Is that right? There's 3 items for us. I'm just going to take the first one and then let others take the first one.
I was thinking that this would be more just generically questions about the presentation.
Right.
And then I think we could answer all 3 together when we get to answering staff's questions.
Right. Sorry, I was on staff's questions to us, so I'm on the first question for staff. So sorry if I'm out of order. Should I address the first question in the slide for us about do we have questions?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So sorry to make that confusing. Devin, thank you. So I have just a question or two at the high level of intent. You talked quite a bit about the Vision Zero and the safety aspects of it, but I know there are other goals too. I understand there are other goals. I understand historically level of service is throughput of vehicles. You could maybe explain it better than me, but that's actually something that is maybe drives our decisions more primarily, or at least historically. But I'm just kind of that's my sense. So I'm just curious, can you say more about the goals, goals overall of signals besides Vision Zero, just to give a sense of the the kind of whole set of goals we should be thinking about that you're trying to manage?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ryan. I think I understand it. I mean, I think if you think of the signal system as a system, I mentioned there are over 150 signals throughout the city. So that is they represent a point along the transportation system where many users pass through every day in many different modes of travel. And so for that reason, there are a lot of considerations that go into how the signals operate. And while safety is, of course, paramount and of importance toward our Vision Zero goal, we understand that there are other considerations, and some of those are, the comfort level for people as they're crossing the street. Some of those are how buses are moving through intersections efficiently or not. So those are really a lot of the considerations that we're weighing in this practice update, but it's really the safety data that has driven us to those topic areas that we intend to focus on most closely.
Okay, I guess I'm wondering about the constraints with these safety goals. For example, is level of service a goal? Like, is that something that is a goal that we're kind of constrained by in a sense, or is level of service not something we're constrained by?
Yeah, I mean, it is a consideration, but I think it's one that as we work on the core arterial network, we are challenging ourselves to look at differently, and we are looking at how the system can be transformed, again, for all users. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, but yeah.
Fine. Okay, then I'm good for now. I'll leave the rest for the next ones. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Tina?
Hi, thank you for providing all the information about traffic signals. And the first question was just in terms of the volume of pedestrians, bikers, cars, et cetera, that move through Boulder and our crash rate, how do we compare with other cities that have the similar type of movement through its streets and city?
That is a good question. I don't have the exact numbers at my fingertips, but there was a prior memo that we had issued, and I don't remember if it was to TAB or to council, but we looked at how Boulder is performing relative to other cities. And in terms of crash rates, Boulder was, I think, second best in the region. Only behind Arvada in terms of the crash rate.
Okay. And I'd love to, hear more about that just so I can, we can kind of benchmark with how we're doing and when are we falling behind? Also, do we know how many of the severe crashes resulted in the death of a person?
Yeah, I don't have that data available at my fingertips either, but historically across the city, we have between like 0 and 5 fatal crashes in a year.
Okay.
So if you were to do a proportion, but I'd have to look into that further to get you a clear answer.
Okay, and then I have just one last question, which is, how do we have a lot of new people come into our town every year because of CU in part. We have, I think, between a few thousand. And how do we think about how some of the traffic technology that we use might feel different to them, like 2 flashing yellows that you find over by the Whole Foods, or the flashing yellow lights that are in some parts of town, but not as many as there used to be. How do we think about those changes? Like, do we draw in that part of the community so that they become familiar with what might be unfamiliar signaling?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we've been very fortunate in that really a lot of areas of the country have caught on to that flashing yellow arrow. So I think that is not something that's necessarily new to people anymore, regardless of where they come from. I can remember the first time I saw one, I honestly was confused by it. This was like 20 years ago. So I was a new driver and it was, a new technology. But I think that is part of the need for the practices though, right? Is to make sure that decisions are made consistent with what industry trends are, what engineering best practices are, and that we conform to national standards in a way that doesn't confuse people as they travel through Boulder.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tina. I see Nicole up next.
Thanks for the presentation, Devin. I just had a question around the statistic for severe crashes that are occurring at signalized intersections. It's about 37% of all the severe crashes in the city are occurring at signalized intersections, if I understood it correctly. Does that 37% differently involve pedestrians and bicyclists? Like, is the number of severe crashes that are involving pedestrians or bicyclists, is it different, or the percentage at signalized intersections versus other areas where crashes occur?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think, to be quite honest, because of that, the detail in it, I would need to check into it a little more.
Okay.
I do have our Safe Streets report up, and that's probably a good reference to check, but let me get back to you on that specific
Okay,
question.
thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Next up, I see Mark and Tina. Is that your previous hand still up, or do you have another?
I really just have one question. Is there any correlation between the occurrence of accidents and game days for the football season? When we have a great influx of out-of-towners, people are, shall we say, enjoying themselves, possibly a little bit to excess. So is there any factor relating to accidents and our football season?
Not that I'm aware of, but I don't know that we've looked into that in great detail. But nothing stands out that I'm aware of.
Okay, might be interesting to check.
Thank you, Mark. And then I had a question around, we have kind of a regular intersection with the lights that we're all used to. I also notice around town we have a lot of kind of pedestrian crossing with specialized lights. And for me, sometimes when I'm driving, those, especially when I was new to Boulder, those caught me by surprise a little bit, or I wasn't sure exactly how to navigate them. Is that really the best practice, or would it be better to have them mimic a more typical intersection signal?
Are you describing the rapidly flashing yellow lights? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, those are a different type of crossing treatment referred to as a rectangular rapid flashing beacon. And those are a nationally used treatment type for primarily mid-block crossings of pedestrians. So I realize they are different than a signal, but that flashing yellow indication is intended to convey caution and a need to yield to pedestrians if they are crossing in the crosswalk.
And typically we find them to be relatively safe compared to other kinds of potential treatments.
Yeah, yes, we do. That is something that the update to the pedestrian crossing treatment installation guidelines looked at. And there are national best practices now that do recommend under more conditions going to a higher level of crossing treatment type, which is more in line with a traditional signal. So you might start to see fewer of those RRFBs and more either traditional red, yellow, green signals, or there's a different type of signal that's out there that's referred to as a pedestrian hybrid beacon signal. And there are a few of those along South Boulder Road in Louisville and Lafayette.
Thank you for that. Seeing as I don't see any other hands, I feel like we're ready to move on to question number 2, which is, does council have any questions about the overall intent of the signal practices update as a Vision Zero action action plan action item? Any questions related to that? If not, we could move on to item 3. Does council have any feedback on the proposed scope of work outlined in the study session memo? Someone's got to have some thoughts there, don't they? Perfect. Ryan, and then Nicole, and then Matt.
Okay. Thank you again, Devin and Valerie and team. I have a few suggestions for scoping. First, I'll just say, message received that there are hardware constraints and there's real financial limits to what we can do quickly. Unfortunately, this isn't all just computer programming, so we have to be mindful about that. I hear you. So I think I have just like maybe 5 things here. So we received a message, I think it was on December 5th, from Sue Prant at Community Cycles, that had proposed a kind of a way to think about the purpose overall, and it gets at addressing some bigger questions like why do we have signals in the places that we have them, and who gets priority with coordination, and how to think about that. I found that message to be pretty compelling as a way to think about what we're doing overall. So I really like that. So that's my first thought. Second thought, this might be something Sue touched on, but I would just say more affirmatively that I would like us to look at the goals of our signals. And I appreciate the significant focus on safety, but I also think there's other goals. And one of the things that often gets lost when we talk about safety is safety doesn't matter only for safety's sake, although that is extremely important. Safety is also important to unlock access for people. And the decisions we make about how safe something is defines who gets to use the thing. For example, I have an 8-year-old kid, and there are certain signals that I would let her use on her own, others I wouldn't. So one of the values decisions we make in these signal engineering exercises is to decide what is the minimum age of a kid who can use the thing. Another one would be certainly somebody who's using a cane or a wheelchair or is just maybe slower than the average person. What feels comfortable and convenient for them to be able to cross. So those are just a couple of examples to try to make it vivid that we implicitly should care about not just safety itself, but the role that comfort and a feeling of safety enables access. So that's a goal I would hope would be a part of our signals program. I think, implicitly it is to some extent, and I would just love to see in this exercise, if we could, to be deliberate about defining what are the goals. And there's, we could dig into more on the sub parts of the access and who gets the access, but I think we should do that. Obviously, climate action comes from access in these places too. So I would like to be deliberate into that, example of level of service. What do we, I think we have 7 groups of time signals or something like that. I would hope that we could look at that question and with all of our goals. So that's the second one. The third one is who benefits. Yeah, who benefits? Just that we can, that we give some thought to in particular users that have perhaps haven't, maybe aren't drivers and haven't found it as easy to get around outside of a vehicle. That this initiative takes an equity approach and just looks at that carefully. Another one is that ideally, I'm not sure if you're asking for this feedback, but ideally there would be transparent presentation of this at the end, such that, you know, somebody could know by looking at an intersection, you know, this is the principle or the design, you know, factor that led to it being this way. I think I'm maybe done. Oh, I guess one other thought would be, you know, this is my last thought, that safety is crucial. Oftentimes we think about safety in terms of what has historically happened with the crash, but we also, of course, know that a probabilistic view, because of the kind of environment that we understand that's in front of us, is important. It's not just what has previously happened that defines what's safe. And to that same extent, users who are wrestling with an intersection or a signal, and they have specific feedback, you know, user feedback, I would just encourage that we look for ways to make it really easy and apparent for people to continue to contribute to our design of this as we go. Inquire Boulder, I think, is excellent. I use it a lot. So maybe it's not much more than some kind of linkage with that. But I'm just thinking about this. The idea of creating signal practices is partly the plan itself, but then it's also making it a living plan so that people as they go can use and contribute, which I do think we do a pretty good job as a city. So I just ask to kind of give that you know, a look as well. Thanks again for your team and the hard work on this important work.
Thank you for those comments, Ryan. Next, we have Nicole.
Thank you. And thanks so much for the presentation. I really appreciated just the thorough and very informative memo and on what we can and can't do easily and what the constraints are that we're facing. So thank you for that. As somebody who does not live in this transportation signal world, it was very helpful. One of the things that I was just left wondering about in thinking about approaching the scope of this project is, I feel like, you know, we have information on where the severe crashes and fatal crashes are happening. What we don't necessarily know, and Tab picked up on this a little bit in their September discussion as well, was where are people not going because it doesn't feel safe or because they've had near misses? And are there ways that we can, you know, think about the signal practices at other kinds of intersections? I don't even know how we find those people in those places where these are happening, but it feels like we are missing information on where people are being dissuaded from using some of these signalized intersections, and in only focusing on the severe crashes. And I don't have a solution for you on how we find that information, but it really just had me thinking about where we're seeing people not use our infrastructure just because people don't feel safe there. I think kind of to Ryan's point around accessibility. So as we kind of head into this project, I mean, I'm not asking for like a different scoping or anything like that, but just how are we going in with the intention to try to get some information out around how we encourage more use of these intersections and the signals, because we really want people to use our non-car infrastructure, and are there things that we can do with this update that would help us get at that issue? So sorry, I got up early and was on a plane most of the day. So if that doesn't make sense, Devin, I'm happy to retry it. But really just thinking about how we are missing some information that we're not getting because crashes aren't happening, but that's not necessarily because the intersections are safe or safer, but rather because the pedestrians or folks are not using those places because they've had bad experiences, or we're not hearing about the bad experiences that they've had because they're having to be hyper vigilant in those places.
Nicole, I wonder if I might speak to that. This is Valerie Watson, Interim Transportation Mobility Director. I really am so appreciative that you raised that topic. We're really lucky that we have our 2019 pedestrian plan to draw from, which was the result of a very intensive community process. And it resulted in a methodology to identify areas of the city that are precisely what you were just describing. And those are those pedestrian improvement areas that we had a little snapshot of up on the screen in the presentation. And that combined with the near misses that are reported to us through the online portal that we have for community members to enter information into for us, as well as just other ways we gather information from the community, can all help us get a better sense for those types of locations that really, not only cross over where we're seeing the higher incidence of severe crashes, but also where that pedestrian comfort factor is just lacking. So yeah, I think that is very much going to be a part of what drives the scope of work that we'll be taking next year.
No, thank you. And I wanted to note the impressive statistic of having reduced crashes in through left turn, left signal phasing changes by 68%. That was a really impressive number. And so just kudos to all of you for the work you're doing on that as well. And hopefully we see more of those big reductions after these changes too.
Thank you, Nicole. Next up, we have Matt and then Tina.
Appreciate that, Lauren. First, I'll start off by saying I appreciate the great info in the memo, and more importantly, the great work that the department is doing. I have to say that, Valerie, since you became interim, you guys haven't skipped a beat, and you guys are still crushing. So it's just great to see that. And I think that's just a testament to the team, and really the cohesiveness of the work that we're doing with Vision Zero and the action plan and CAN. And everything being bought in. So I just great appreciation for that and how we're moving forward. But along those lines, I'm going to take maybe a different approach here, which is I think to some extent, I think this particular discussion, I would have been more than happy to have just had a memo on, because for me, the high level decisions we're making was CAN, really seeing that action plan and knowing in that action plan that staff was going to get to the signals policy and really sort of work through that as it relates back to Vision Zero and the action plan. And just getting an update about where that where that was going would have been fine for me. And so I think in general, I look at discussions like this and I see it being highly technical, full of engineering. And I look at that and I go, I got to trust staff to really handle that within the value space that we've defined in the action plan and not get us in the weeds of those pieces. So I like to kind of just unleash you guys to do the great work and not feel like you got to pause and do that. And so in general, I want to keep us going forward on topics like this at a much higher level, and let our staff do the great work that they are here to do as our resident experts. So love the presentation, but I think going forward, let's let you guys just crush it and get after it. And we can stay at a much higher level in the visioning of where things are going. So great job and really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Next, Tina.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, and Matt, thank you for your comments. I share some of them, but also am glad to see the progress the city's made. And the one thing I'll just call out is that there's mention of adding into the scope of work what signalization might look like for a two-way bike lane with a separator, which is, I think, what is being proposed in Iris. So I do look forward, but not necessarily in a work session, perhaps in a memo, but just to understand, and actually I was just happy that we're thinking about that and looking at how that's going to work, because that's a little bit of a new format that we're looking at. Thanks.
Thank you, Tina. Unless I see any other hands pop up, it sounds like I'm hearing a lot of support for, continuing to put safety first with the hopes of rider shift and increasing usage, making sure that we're taking an equity approach, and trying to continue finding ways for the public to contribute and participate in this process moving forward, but maybe with less staff or with less council participation as we just, give our support for your work moving forward. On that, I think it is time to move into our next discussion. I don't know whether water-wise landscaping or wildfire hardening is coming first, but I will let Nuria kick that off and we'll find out.
Thank you so much, Mayor Pro Tem, and I'll just say I know staff has 2 presentations here, and you can see Wildfire is coming up first. I want to thank staff. We're going to try to keep it to 15 minutes each, and say that as we were trying to accommodate a 3rd item on today's council agenda, staff really did a great job of trying to be concise with what is essentially, you sneaky council people, 2 priorities into one. Don't think that we didn't notice that. And so as we think about today's council priority, or priorities, we will look and start with wildfire hardening. And with that, I will pass it on to Lisa.
Thank you, Nuria. Good evening, council members. My name is Lisa Hood. I'm a principal city planner with Planning and Development Services. We have a large team of many different departments who are also here to answer any of your questions, but I will give the presentation on our wildfire hardening part of this priority. So as Nuria already mentioned, this is really 2 topics, 2 presentations, 2 discussions, and you had 2 memos. So we're going to start out with wildfire hardening. I know since this is one of your council priorities, you all are probably very familiar with the term wildfire hardening, but for anyone else who might be watching and hasn't heard of it, I just want to start out with some basic definitions of what we're talking about. So when we talk about wildfire hardening, we are talking about ensuring that buildings are prepared for a wildfire or for embers, really trying to reduce vulnerability and increasing the resistance to threat. I thought this graphic does a really good job of showing the 2 focuses. First, the ignitability of the actual structure, but wildfire hardening also includes thoughts about the defensible space. So how do those features that surround a structure impact the hardening of that structure or the defensibility against wildfire? In this presentation, you're also going to hear the acronym, the WUI, a lot. So I wanted to describe what that is. So the WUI is the Wildland Urban Interface, and that is the geographical area where structures and other human development meets or intermingles with wildland or vegetative fuels. And you can see the map of our current WUI area. It's mostly following the western boundary of our city limits. I wanted to start the presentation, and it's really how I kind of started taking on this project, by explaining all of the current efforts, or trying to understand all the current efforts that the city is already undertaking related to wildfire risk mitigation, and then the policies that set the framework for that. So we got together all of the different departments just to understand what everyone is doing related to wildfire risk mitigation. There is a lot of work being done throughout the city organization. Nearly every single city department has a program, operations, plan, something that they're working on to improve Boulder's resistance to wildfire. And so this is just a great constellation graphic to help you understand all the different work in those different departments. We also have a number of key partnerships that help move that work forward. We have the Wildfire Core Team, and these are within the city and also with external partners. The County Fire Shed, first response agreements, things like that, that help continue work towards wildfire hardening our community. Another thing to understand is the key elements of wildfire mitigation as an umbrella. And so there are a number of things that a local government can do to reduce the risk of wildfire in their community. And those 4 things are regulations, education and incentives, plans and policies, and programs and operations. From that constellation graphic, all of these are just a few examples of everything falls into one of these categories. And for the purpose of this council priority project, we're really focused on the regulation side. That's the highlighted side. So the work product that you would see from this program, priority project, would be focused on the regulatory side. So changes to our building code and land use code and other codes and standards. However, it will all inform these other aspects of wildfire mitigation, the education and incentives, plans and policies and programs and operations. But I thought it was helpful to think about both all the work that the city is working on already, how it fits into this umbrella, and how this project fits in. There's also a number of policies that guide this work, from our strategic plan to our SER framework, comprehensive plan, and you'll remember the Community Wildfire Protection Plan that was adopted just earlier this year, which assessed the risk in our community and set forward a bunch of strategies and policies, including something that aligns perfectly with this work of looking at our codes and standards. In addition to the local government efforts, I wanted you all to be aware of the efforts at the state level as well. If you may have already heard of this, but in 2023, the Colorado State Legislature passed a bill that created the Wildfire Resiliency Code Board. And what that is it's currently under development, so it's happening simultaneous to this project. And what the law says is that this board has to adopt a model code for the WUI areas of Colorado, and jurisdictions like Boulder who are located within the WUI must adopt at least the base of that model code within 3 months of their adoption. So by July 1st, the model code will be adopted. We'll have 3 months to ensure that our code is meeting at least the minimum of what that statewide model code is. We've been engaged in the stakeholder engagement process for the development of the code. And from what it looks like with initial drafts, because Boulder's had the international WUI code adopted for over a decade, we actually are probably more restrictive than what the state code is going to end up being. However, we'll keep apprised of what happens and what that ultimate model code is, and there might be tweaks that we would need to make in order to align with the model code as we learn more later in the year. As far as schedule for this project, we're planning to complete this project by the end of next year. It's a 2024-2025 priority project. We've been working on scoping and research so far, and what we're envisioning and how it was laid out in the memo and is laid out for the presentation is really 2 sets of changes. Changes that would affect the building code, and then changes that would affect the land use code. We're envisioning that building code changes would happen earlier next year, and then land use code changes would come probably in the fall. And then there's the little window to indicate that we would have different engagement windows for each of those sets of changes. Speaking of engagement, the anticipated level of engagement is consult for this project. We have a lot of input that we got very recently on the Community Wildfire Protection Plan that we're hoping, or we know will be really helpful to inform this project, because there's a lot of overlap in topics. And then we'd be implementing a number of engagement strategies for this project as well throughout the year. And we're anticipating refining the engagement plan based on the conversation tonight as well. All right, so that's kind of all the background. Now I want to give an overview of our initial staff analysis and our initial recommendations. And that will kind of tee up the discussion questions for you all. I want to start with an explanation of our current WUI regulations. So right now, the City of Boulder has adopted the 2018 IWUIC, which is a horrible acronym to say, so I'm just going to call it an International WUI Code, that's what it stands for, with some local amendments. And what that does is, in the WUI area that I already described, it requires all new construction, additions, and remodels in that area to meet additional standards. So those are standards related to fire-resistant materials, underfloor areas, roof coverings, eaves, gutters, windows, ventilation openings. Those are very common issues that are addressed through the International WUI Code. Boulder first adopted the WUI Code, International WUI Code, in 2014. And just to give you an idea, like I said, it's a small sliver along the western side of the city, but in that small area, we've had 900 building permits that have been approved in that 10-year period, including about 50 new structures in that area and 50 decks that were either new decks or refurbished decks that would have had to comply with these increased fire resistance standards. As part of understanding this project, we also did peer community research, really to understand kind of the structure of how other communities are regulating wildfire hardening. Right now, Boulder, like I said, regulates it through the International WUI Code, which is part of our building codes. That's why that box is highlighted. But there are, and we actually don't have any wildfire standards in our land use code. There are other communities that have only their wildfire standards. Their wildfire standards are only in their land use code. And then many communities, especially in Colorado, have both standards in their building code that are related to the building, and then also standards in their land use code that are usually more related to site-specific standards. Some other communities have standalone ordinances, but really it's more common to be either a land use code or building code regulatory scheme. So based on that initial, both the best practices research and then our own staff analysis, we have established some general initial staff recommendations for you all to consider. And I'm looking forward to discussing those. But first, it would be changes to the building code. So I should have mentioned that for those international codes, we adopt those on a 6-year schedule. And so they come out every 3 years, but we adopt a new set of international codes every 6 years. So I mentioned we have the 2018 WUI code adopted. So we're scheduled to adopt the 2024 WUI code. And with that, the recommendations for some changes are listed on this slide. So first, I'll start with the citywide changes. Staff is recommending council consider at a citywide level, not just to WUI, requiring building permits for window replacement and siding replacement. It's actually unique that Boulder doesn't require that already for building permits, and that would be a really great check to ensure that these two very vulnerable parts of a home in the WUI area are compliant with those fire resistant standards. It also would have a number of other benefits outside of the city, so we're recommending that citywide. Now within the WUI specifically, we have some recommendations that would apply as we've initially considered it to new construction only. The first of these is something that communities have been adopting in recent years, especially as we've seen the impact of recent fires related to fencing. And so one requirement would be requiring non-combustible fences and other structures within 8 feet of a habitable structure. So what we've seen in recent fires is that a wooden fence around your property can act somewhat like a fuse to the house. And so if you have that break of non-combustible materials from the fence to the house for 8 feet, that can provide really significant protection for the structure. So that would be a requirement for all new construction. Also a requirement for a 5-foot non-combustible zone. That's a 5-foot perimeter around a building where no combustible materials could be located. And thirdly, in the new construction in the WUI, requiring low flammability plants only in that defensible space area. So if you think back to that graphic, the area between 5 feet and 30 feet from a home, you would only have plants that have low flammability. There's no plant that is fireproof, but there are certainly some that are more flammable than others. So in that way, we could prohibit specific plants that are known to be highly flammable, such as junipers. And then outside of the WUI, so I mentioned the WUI is kind of a sliver along the western edge. One thing we're considering is whether to expand that WUI area into more of an affected area where perhaps there's a lower risk, so it's not necessarily within the exact WUI area, but based on fire modeling and data, that there is a slightly higher risk than for the rest of the city. And in that area, you might not have the requirements for the structure hardening, like the structure ignitability part of that graphic, but you would have requirements for the vegetation management and defensible space in that expanded area. And then related to those changes, there would also be kind of simultaneous changes to definitions and specific language on specific materials. So that's the set of changes that we've thought through so far, just initial considerations for your discussion tonight. And that's related to building code. Then we have some recommendations for land use code. So after seeing what some other communities are doing, we do recommend council consider adding some wildfire standards into our land use code. Specifically, we saw a lot of communities do a wildland urban interface overlay district that would match the overlay, the geography of the WUI area in the building code, but it would allow us to have some land use and development standards that are site specific on the zoning side of things. And right now we do have some standards already in the land use code, like standards related to landscaping and fencing, where it would make sense to beef those up with WUI specific standards. And by having an overlay district, you can apply those standards into a specific geography. So similarly to what I've already described about the landscaping, that could be located in the land use code, and then also related to fencing that could be in the land use code. In that way, what we saw in other communities is it's enforceable from both land use perspective and building code perspective. And then some specific plans like fuels assessment or fuels management and hazard assessment plans could be checked at the same time as zoning is already checking for other site-specific compliance. With all of these changes, there are important considerations to make. These are all important steps that Boulder could take, but we do want to just highlight that adding any additional standards will require the support of additional staffing. It seems simple to just add code language in, but it all trickles down to additional needs for staff for plan review, to review the additional plans and compliance for those standards, additional staff for inspections, and then ultimately additional staff for enforcement. And so we want to keep that in mind while we're considering these changes. And then also, like I said, it's an umbrella. And so all of these regulatory changes will also inform those other aspects of Boulder's approach to wildfire mitigation. I wanted to highlight some of the recent successes with our incentive and education programs. The Wildfire Resilient Grants Program just started back in September, so only a few months ago. We've already had 53 executed contracts where people have used that grant funding to complete wildfire hardening work on their home. And then we have our detailed home assessment program, which is also very successful. We've had 406 of those assessments completed since November of last year, and we actually had 326 people sign up since September of this year, which is actually more than signed up after the Marshall Fire. In addition, we have a lot of other incentive and education programs, communications and outreach and workshops that we already do as well. With that, I have the questions that were in the memo, but what we're hoping for from this discussion tonight is guidance from council on the recommended changes related to the building code and then also to the land use code, and generally the approach that the direction that council would like us to go in with this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was a great and very informative presentation. I'm going to recommend that we start with any questions we have for staff related to this topic before we jump into the questions. And when we get to those questions, just because I know, I mean, even I have a hard time keeping straight land use versus building code things, I think we might want to answer those together. So I see Mark, it looks like he has his hand up first, followed by Matt and then Taisha.
Yeah, thanks. I have just a couple of questions, but I have to preface it. I sent out a hotline asking a number of questions yesterday, and Lisa, the response that I received was extraordinarily comprehensive and answered every question completely. This was great, a great piece of work. I had not anticipated receiving a written response in such a short amount of time. And it was just great work. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. As for my questions, is it contemplated that the new construction regulations would also apply to major reconstructions? We've all seen buildings in Boulder where the developer leaves one wall standing so he can be treated as a reconstruction, not as a new development or a new construction, but everything is new except for a piece of a wall. So it would seem to me that in those situations we might want to consider making these regs applicable as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that that is open for the direction that council would like us to go in of what we would like, what kind of projects you would like any additional regulations to apply to. Certainly from looking at the different communities, everyone does it slightly differently, whether it only applies to new construction. There are a lot of places that will have those WUI requirements apply to new construction. Anything that changes by a certain square footage, like if you're adding 200 square feet to your home. There's other examples like our current landscaping regulations. The project value determines what standards apply. So if it's a significant remodel, that's a certain percentage of the value of the home, then the standards kick in. So I think it's open to council's wish of which types of projects you'd like it to apply to. And so, yeah, that's kind of the direction we hope for tonight.
Okay, well, this council member would urge you to be as broad as possible within reason. Obviously, if somebody's doing a repainting of their house, that's not quite what we have in mind. But as I said, when they knock down most of the structure and leave a wall standing and then build around the wall, which probably will come down eventually anyway, I would think we'd want to do that.
Council member, if I can interject, this is Brad Mueller, Director of Planning and Development Services.
Yes, you can interject.
Just to elaborate on Lisa's response to it, might be useful for the Chief Building Official, Rob Adrians, to elaborate a little bit more on what already triggers those requirements, so you can kind of understand where on the scale that already exists.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here, Brad. So to that question, the example you described of a building just having one wall remaining, that would be a level 3 alteration, and that would already be required to come into compliance with the Wildland Urban Interface Code that we've already adopted. So they would have to do all the fire hardening, okay, fire resistant siding, everything, depending on what level of the WUI they're in, right? But they would have to comply with new construction requirements anyway.
Okay, and just two very quick questions, one comment, one question, very brief. In terms of expanding the WUI, I think, yeah, we really ought to be looking at that. The WUI is pretty skinny, and I think it leaves a lot of the community very vulnerable to wildfires. And my question is, do we, in the WUI, are we going to require coverings on vents, mesh coverings or something to prevent embers from getting inside a house? Is that contemplated?
Yeah, I'll point to Rob again. I think we already require that. Is that right?
That is correct. Yes, we already require 1/8 inch screens on all openings, whether you're in the class 1, class 2, or class 3 area of the WUI. So all risk areas require mesh on the openings.
I better get them. I better get some then. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Next up, we have Matt.
Appreciate it, Lauren. Yeah, I too really appreciated Lisa's response to Mark's hotline. That was spot on and thorough. Yeah, I mean, you work with PNDS, but you could also work with BFR while you're at it too. So I mean, double dipping. My question, I'll get to some obviously the questions 1 and 2 in a bit, but my question really centers specifically around. And I know Nuria took a shot at Lauren and I squeezing this as a merger at our retreat.
With love, Matt, with love.
But in my question actually centers on why these are intrinsically connected, and which was that in one of the recommended changes would be in new construction to ban planting of juniper. I think that it makes sense that if we are telling people they can't plant something, that we are also thus providing a list of things that are approved for them to plant. So I just want to make sure that we're looking at both sides of that and have a plan for if we're saying no to this, but we can then give you a list of what you can do, that those are married together in action. We may get to that with landscaping, but it meets here with the wildfire as well.
Yes, that is the connecting point is plants between these two topics. So yeah, I'll talk about that with the waterwise landscaping, but there's a number of great resources already out there for low flammability plants, but we'd envision creating our own plant list that would be able to provide recommendations for those plants that have lower flammability.
All right. My last question centers around we're engaging in our comprehensive planning process. To what extent in the past has wildfire mitigation been thematic in how we plan our built environment? And if not, what is the plan to make that very much a cornerstone of how we think about the built environment and make us fire resilient for decades to come?
Lisa, I'm happy to jump in on that one if you like. Thank you for the question, Councilman. There's really two answers to that. You know, a lot of what will be the focus of the comprehensive plan are going to be driven by feedback from council, from the four bodies, from the public. We would anticipate, though, that that's a high area of interest, and to the degree that the current plan does speak to it, but there's yet opportunities to refine or be more precise about what those goals could look like for the 20-year time horizon that is part of the comprehensive plan. I think we're all anticipating that that's going to be a critical enhancement.
Thanks, Brad. That's it for me.
Thank you, Matt. Next up, I see Taisha and then Tina.
Thank you so much. I also thank my colleagues for some questions that I had that were answered, so I appreciate that. So you mentioned that that our primary focus for this effort is around regulations, and that the education, incentives, and planning are things that would come out of those regulations. But one of the things I think that would be helpful prior to having to make some of the policy decisions is around the effectiveness of some of the education and incentive plans that we have been offering. It's very helpful to know how many, so that output data was very helpful. But you know, as it relates to the map of the WUI, and just, you know, getting a better idea just geographically where our efforts have been, and just the quality of efforts across, to then inform the kinds of regulations that we want to form here. And similarly with the policies as well. One question that I had around that was around the fiscal note. And so I'm just going to circle back to getting some financial information. It was really helpful in the presentation and in the document, the reference to the cost of enforcement, planning, and review. But just the level of effort across the different types of changes would be really helpful into determining, and not just the level of effort and cost to the city, but potentially some proposed, or just some kind of targets of what are the potential costs at the commercial or real estate level for, you know, for our potential tenants, or, you know, landowners, et cetera. So those are some of the, I guess my question is, in lieu of not having that, would it be possible to get a little bit more information of just some of the costs that are associated with some of the tiers of enforcement that are indicated in both the land use and
Councilmember, I'm happy to jump in on that one too, which is to say the information we get tonight to give us kind of guidance in what direction was exactly the information that will allow us to bring that kind of cost benefit analysis forward. So we will in a broad sense, which is what I understand you to be asking, be an item we'd be able to bring forward then in the future. Oops, you're on mute.
Yeah, you're muted.
Sorry, thank you so much. I thought it was interesting that the document talked about the alignment with the urban forest plan, but that the urban forest plan had no specific call out to wildfire resilience. And so I was just kind of curious, that made me wonder, when are we updating? It looked like the urban forestry plan was updated in 2018. And so just kind of my question was, is that also going to be updated or incur? Basically, how does the policies that we're setting have legs across some of the documents that are still in play but haven't been updated yet?
That's a great question. And I have a large team here, but I'm not sure that we have anyone from forestry in particular to answer that question. I don't know if anybody else knows the answer and wants to jump in. I don't
And
know.
I'm fine to get
I
it
can get
later
back to you
too.
on that one.
Knowing that there's going to be another iteration, it's just more so the alignment across plans, because that's you all did such a great job of showing that alignment, but then there were just some gaps, so it would just kind of be helpful to get that information in the future. Thank you so much, and those are my questions.
Thanks.
Thank you, Taisha. Next we have Tina.
Hi, I was just wondering if we have seen any evidence in other communities that if we were to expand the WUI, would that in fact impact possibly the insurance rates for the people in that expanded area? Or are they still pretty separate, that the insurance companies are doing their own calculations?
I might call in our fire rescue folks to answer that, but I believe that my understanding is that the insurance companies do their own kind of risk modeling, and so it's not necessarily tied to the regulations or what we map as WUI. Looks like Dave Lowry turned his camera on, so I'm gonna pass to him.
Yeah, it's not hurting, right? We know that. The insurance companies aren't exactly looking at lowering the rates. It's more about keeping people insured, right? So we have engaged with insurance companies. The community of Wildfire across the nation, the states basically have tried to engage with them, and there's just a lot of work to be done with insurance company. What our goal really is to build this resilience community, to give those insurance companies a reason to say yes to insuring our community members, right? We can't really ever control the rates or get the rates to be lowered. I think that's, all about their business. But to keep people with insurance is what we've been engaging them about.
Okay, thanks. That's all I have.
Thank you, Tina. Unless there are any other hands, I think it's time to move into our the questions that staff asked around if we support or if we have feedback on the recommended changes in the building code amendments or land use code proposed changes. I can kick us off. I think, I really appreciated the changes, particularly around non-combustible fencing, a non-combustible zone around structures. And I would love to see a really simplified fire-wise planting requirements, particularly around maybe what's not allowed and some recommendations of easy alternates. And I think that those might make sense not just in the WUI, but potentially throughout Boulder. I mean, my understanding is that in general, our community is at a fairly heightened risk of fire. And I would be interested in seeing what trade-offs are around an expanded map or just having a ubiquitous standard. I appreciate our current WUI requirements and that those match national code. I feel a little unsure about our potentially increasing permit requirements for siding and windows. We already have regulations around them, and I kind of believe that people who aren't following those are also going to probably be the people who don't comply with submitting for permit on them. And so I'm not sure that I think that that's really going to gain us more compliance in that zone, but could potentially just add to additional paperwork. And then in general, with sort of special maps and districts, I would like to avoid that to the extent that we can implement most of what we want without it, ideally. But I mean, if we need to go that direction, I'm open to it. I would just prefer to avoid it if we can. And also with sort of our planting plans and things like that, the more we can make sure that any requirements are very simple and easy to implement and prove, I think would be ideal. So that's my feedback on what I've seen thus far. I don't see any hands yet for who wants to go next. Okay, I see Mark. Thank you, Mark.
I would be supportive of most of what Lauren has proposed. I think simplicity is important. I'm not sure I wouldn't have a different standard in the WUI, just because it's part of that marketing effort towards insurance companies to show how serious we are about mitigating wildfire risk. But I think a lot of those standards should also be applied elsewhere in the city. I don't think there's a reason, for instance, to place a juniper anywhere. We know how dangerous they are, we know how flammable they are, and we know what our community risk is. And I would simply discourage or even ban the planting of junipers in any kind of new construction or class 3 remodel. Again, I would emphasize that I would leave to staff to figure out exactly the mechanism they want to employ, with the understanding that they will focus on clarity and simplicity. And I don't know that that's anything more than promulgating a series of regulations and ordinances. I don't know that we need overlay maps, etc. Just be simple, be clear, tell people what they can do, tell people what they can't do, and let's get the community activated in support of this objective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Next up, I see Matt and then Tina.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, sometimes less is more. Simplicity is always the way to go. I support that. I want to piggy a little bit back on what Mark was saying. Obviously, we have, as we see current definitions of where our WUI is. Well, there's two conflicting definitions of where our WUI map is right now, and there might even now be a third when the state gets involved, and we're going to have to juggle those. And to some extent, I kind of feel like we kind of have to just operate the way we want to protect our community and only use them as a guidepost, not a restriction. And one thing that I get interested about is the Marshall Fire started in the east part of our city. So where are we discussing the wild urban interface there? And we're surrounded by a green belt. So our wild urban interface is different than most communities. And so I'd love to see us think broadly about the rest of the city. And because I think we've been so focused on the west, which is probably the predominant area, but yet the biggest fire in our regional history happened east of here. So I think we need to maybe think a little bit more comprehensively with that. But then that also means if we're doing this overlay, do we apply it to the eastern edge as well? I'd love to. I think where Mark's going, I think some of the stuff may need to be citywide. We're thinking about more of a collar than sort of a western flank in this, or having WUI adjacent so that there's something secondary that can cover those areas as well. So I think there's an opportunity for that with regards to our current building code and amendments.
Thank you, Matt. Next, it's Tina.
Yeah, I'm open to the recommendations from staff, and we'll be looking forward to hearing more about it. I think over time I'd be interested in just better understanding which efforts will have the most impact versus the cost, and just making sure we're focusing on the highest impact changes first, and then and doing enforcement that's also relative to impact. And that's pretty much it. I just really appreciate the convening of all the departments and thinking about all the different ways these interactions happen, sort of whether we decide how far east to go or whatever. I'll just be looking for staff for guidance on that. I think this looks great.
Thank you, Tina. Next, I see Taisha.
Thank you. I echo Matt's recommendation to expand or even consider. I like the collar idea. I think it's really important that our policies respond to the lived experiences in our community in the context that we're currently in. And so, if nothing else, I think that eastern section is certainly something, but I would be an advocate for full circle. And the other issue is just around the funding aspect. So I would agree it was wonderful to see all of the different departments and the role that they play, but then it made me wonder, where is the funding sources coming from for those different activities, and going back to which of those funding streams come from federal dollars. I just, which of those are locked in. I just am going back to that fiscal piece, and also with what Tina said, which is what I also shared earlier around, it would be very helpful to have the outcomes and outputs of the programs and efforts that we are currently operating to inform when it becomes time for us to make a policy decision. And that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Taisha. Next, I see Ryan.
Thanks. Yeah, I just probably echo what Tina said mostly. I think I generally agree with the work of staff and appreciate the different parts of the city coming together on this. And I do appreciate what Lauren said about just kind of looking for more ubiquitous standards. I worry about looking at maps and feeling like we have a precision that it will whether or not it's a true precision will change with as our climate changes, and as has been mentioned, there's different political maps and there's different ways the insurance industry is going to think about this, and to use other lived examples, other cities in the West that have experienced tragedies with fire have been completely overwhelmed, the whole cities. And so I think I would just advocate for a kind of overall ratcheting of standards around the city, and maybe be just skeptical about sort of block by block map making, because I think our whole city is very connected on all of this. I'm not a fire expert, so I want to be careful and not try to offer too much advice on this, but just to thank you for your work, and say that I'm supportive of the sort of, as much stringency as we can bring.
Thank you, Ryan. I think does staff, do you have any questions? Does that feel like you covered anything? I feel like I should maybe clarify that on my statement, I wasn't saying that we shouldn't have WUI specific requirements. I just believe that I like the direction staff is going with the WUI specific items, and I appreciate what we already have. It is fairly stringent, but it's good to have that in that particular zone.
Thanks. To your question, I think we have cleared feedback on that. Thank you.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you so much. And that will allow us to move into our next topic, water-wise landscaping.
Hold on. What about question
sorry.
2? What about question 2?
Oh, thank you for that. Question number 2.
I know you love your landscaping, Lauren. You don't...
Oh, this is the associated land use changes. I'm sorry. I was under the... Okay. Does council support the recommended scope and outreach efforts related to the associated land use changes? That's question 2. Yes, Matt.
I was ready to answer that one. So when we moved on, I was like, oh, but there's more. I'm gonna come at this maybe a little contrarian. And so bear with me for a sec. The changes we're making for new construction are great for the new construction and will in time benefit our community after each new construction project. And over enough time, those standards will build a capacity of resiliency that will then make our community safer. But that's future looking. We still have a critical issue now with regards to resiliency, and that is centered on older existing homes that also suffer from poor brush and combustible material mitigation. And so that's the critical safety issue we're dealing with now. And I love the future looking, but I think the scope needs to be greatly expanded so that we're dealing with the now problem, the critical health and life safety issue that's today and tomorrow. And so I really think we need to think creatively, but we need to be bold like we were with shake shingles. It was a fire hazard, it was a known one, and we didn't mess around, and we got that done. And the community is safer for that. And so I really would like to see us flip this around a little bit and think about things like require brush clearing, tree limbing, and a non-combustible zone, not just on permit for remodel, but to force it upon the sale of a house and or new or renewal of a rental license. Because then we're going to capture folks, even if they don't change their building, we're going to rope them into meeting these standards. We already know where this is. We have a curbside assessment of just even in the western edge of Boulder. And I think we can do particular things like considering a grace period from which it is mandatory that you comply. Start with that in a basis. I mean, you look at a red structure, if you look at them on Google Street View or walk near them, you will see that they are old and they are full of trees and juniper and stuff around them. That's the hazard for today. And we've heard from Chief Calderazzo and our other fire experts that as soon as that one house goes, the rest of those homes are in immediate danger. And so this is an equity question and concern that we have. And so I think we need to think of a phased approach to bring homes and bring properties into compliance, regardless of any new construction. And that's going to address the health and safety issue we have now. And I know there's challenges with that, and we've done that with shake shingles in the past. But this is too critical of an issue for us to build our way new to safety over 10, 20, 40 years. So I'm hopeful we can increase that scope and think broad about how we bring existing properties into compliance and protect the community that we love.
Thank you, Matt. I see Teresa has popped up. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, so we'd be happy to look into this. You know, any application that would be perceived as retroactive is potentially fraught. The shake shingles and night skies were both premised upon the end of a useful life of something, and the end of a useful life of a juniper is much, much longer, as you can imagine, and as is other brush. So there's some additional research we would need to do. We would also need to evaluate whether that's within the scope of the priority that council set, as we understood that priority to be proactive. And so that's something that we would look at as well.
Thank you, Teresa. So because I first asked for us to contemplate all these things together, if the hands that I see are up just in relation to giving feedback on what Matt just brought up, I think I might ask us to maybe just do a show of hands on whether that's something we're interested in so that we don't all have to comment on it. But if those are not, if that's not what your hands are about, I will just continue to you first. Okay. Seeing those staying up. So Mark, Tina, and then Aaron.
Well, I am sorry to disappoint, but my comments do relate directly to Matt's comments, and I support that entirely. In light of the extreme gravity of the threat to our community, I would like to see us be as proactive as possible in addressing those kinds of conditions, whether it is for new construction, major renovation, or even existing homes. If we can provide enough lead time, maybe at some point when our finances are better, provide some support for people who are making these changes, but we need to make them. What was the figure that we are at greater risk than 97% of the communities in Colorado? That's an astonishing number. And we need to bring that number down. And the only way to do that is to take very specific actions that address those kinds of conditions. And so I would like to see us do that. And yes, we will have to go to the community and explain what it is we want them to do, why we are doing it, and how we will deal with the expense of doing it. But this is simply a situation that cannot be ignored, and the risk increases in lockstep with climate change. And so if we are 97% today, we may be 99% tomorrow. And you know, this is simply of a greater magnitude than almost anything we have dealt with. I think of a greater threat even than what we did with CU South, because this will affect the entire community, not simply one portion of the community that was specifically in danger. This threatens everybody. And so I am supporting Matt's proposal and would like to get to work on it.
Thanks, Mark. Tina?
Sure. Is it okay if I speak to something different at this?
That was sort of what I was intending with this,
Okay.
yes.
So the only thing or consideration I had was around outreach and engagement with actually both building and land zone. We get a lot of questions about ignition prevention and different things we can do that are sort of separate from the building and the resilience piece. So when we're working with the community, I would encourage that we are clear that this is about the sort of the after the ignition happens, what do we do to stay safe? And just make sure that the community knows where the prevention of ignition conversation is, so that they know that, because I know we're talking about both, and just so the community knows that those two things are happening simultaneously, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And then I see Aaron, your hand.
Yeah, apologies, Lauren, but I just wanted to add a little something beyond a straw poll. But just, Matt, appreciate the urgency that you're bringing to that question. But not to belittle anything, but just a small factual correction. We're at higher risk than 97% of all communities in the country, rather than Colorado. But obviously still a very, very, very big deal. So anyway, Matt, thanks for bringing that up. I would certainly support increasing the triggers by which we would enact requirements. Like I think sale of home sounds great. But the rental license is an intriguing one to think about as well. That sounds like it has potential. I would definitely move cautiously with requiring it retroactively for all properties. Just I think in terms of the magnitude of the administrative overhead, but also just that there are some, say, older property owners on fixed incomes that might struggle to meet some of those requirements. So not saying we shouldn't consider it all, but I would tread carefully in terms of applying something retroactively to every property without some kind of a trigger. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. I see Nuria.
Yep, just a quick point, and I appreciate, Mayor, you mentioning that. And if you're going to move forward with a straw poll, I think that point of clarity would be helpful. I know at the retreat when retroactivity was discussed, it was not moved forward in part because of that administrative enforcement burden. It sounds like now there is a desire to perhaps nuance that to trigger item like the sale of a home or something of that nature. That clarity would be helpful. And then if staff has input on those trade-offs, I would welcome that so that council knows what that looks like.
And just to clarify, Nuria, is that input now before we make our straw poll, or that would be if the straw poll passes information that comes back to us?
I guess, Brad, I'll ask you, I mean, if the straw poll passes, I would presume that you would want to know what that would take. And then staff, depending on that, would want to bring back those trade-offs, because we likely would not be able to move forward. But if staff has input on some of those trade-offs right now, then perhaps I'd invite that before you take that straw poll.
Yeah, thank you, Nuria. I would say it's a little bit chicken and egg. I can certainly give some kind of generalized vision of what it might take to do any type of retroactive enforcement. But I think too, if there was direction from council to explore that possibility, we would be able to quantify that a bit more, not obviously at a budget level, but just in terms of what a program would look like, that type of thing. So just to broadly characterize it, if, for example, there was a prohibition of certain types of plants on existing properties, even within the WUI or more broadly citywide, there would certainly want to be an education program associated with that, so people knew what the law was. So that's probably, you know, a couple people and resources. There would be people that whether if you gave them, you know, a certain amateurization of 3 or 5 years, we know that there still would be folks that would not adhere. So at some point in the future, there would need to be a mechanism for creating enforcement, because of course folks would be resentful if they're doing something legal and then their neighbor is not. So we would start getting calls that you know, we would need to follow up on that, not to mention prospectively doing that. So you can imagine, you know, that there would be a group of enforcement personnel. There's also the follow-up through prosecution and such too. So that's just a broad picture, but we certainly could quantify that in very broad terms under some basic scenarios.
Can I ask?
Yeah. Thank you.
Can I ask? I see Nicole said, but I just had a clarifying. Unless Nicole, you wanted to clarify on what Brad just said. So can I clarify? I mean, there's two aspects of scale here. Certainly, retroactive is one thing unto itself, but the triggers from which force the compliance is an entirely smaller scale, because if we're going to do it on permit, one would imagine it's not a big enough leap, if that's already what we're going to propose to do, to say you then must do it on sale or do it on a renewal or acquiring a new rental license. So I think that there's maybe two separate scopes from which we are considering. And so I just want to make sure we're differentiating those.
Yeah.
This conversation.
I appreciate and hear what you're saying. And I would envision, and of course, this is all a little conceptual, but I would envision, you know, defining a couple different scenarios to that point.
Thank you. I see Teresa, your hand popped up. Is there anything you want to add, or?
I just thank you for that clarification. I can appreciate that distinction. I think each of those carries its own complexities and enforcement issues. And so certainly if there's appetite among enough council members to move forward, then we could look at those things.
Thank you, Teresa. And then Nicole, I see, is this an entirely new topic, or is this related to, because I would kind of like to do the straw poll.
Oh yeah, no, it was, I think I'm just trying to get clarity on like what all the straw poll is entailing and what additional kind of work or research staff is going to be doing with it. And one of the things that I just something Mark said earlier resonated with me around how are we providing some support for folks who, you know, may be required to make these changes along the way. So that was just trying to understand what's the what is the scope of what staff will be looking into if we were to say, yes, please do consider making some of these things retroactive as well.
Yeah, and I'll take a stab at that, which was, I think, you know, Matt's suggestion around, you know, looking at making fees apply at sale or with a rental license. Those seem interesting to me, but I would make, in my mind, it makes sense to only have that apply to something that we deem to be sort of the most problematic issues, or the things that have the largest safety concern. And I think at this point, I would recommend us leaving that up to staff to provide guidance for. And that's what I would recommend that we look at. If that, I see Taisha, you have your hand up. But if no one objects, I would like to maybe straw poll that right now. Okay, so everyone who is in favor of having staff look at what kind of the trade-offs of having some of the most risky of these items be necessary to come into compliance with city rules at sale or with a rental license, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. I count 7 hands. So that looks like it passes. Thank you. And then Taisha.
Yeah.
Or not passes. It looks like there is a majority of council who is interested in having staff work on that. Thank you. Taisha.
And when that comes back, I mean, in general, it would be really helpful to see a map of like what areas have this, have been hardened, like what percentage of the different, sections of the WUI have been hardened. This goes back to my comment about the education and incentive programs that we offer, like where are they located? Are there, just to help support the areas of interest and the areas of most need. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Mark.
I'm a little confused, and so I'm going to ask the question. Is the vote that we just took directing staff to only look at items that come into effect upon sale or conveyance of the property, as opposed to other requirements that might be imposed on properties generally, whether or not they're being sold? I thought one of the things we had been discussing was possibly, and Matt, tell me if I'm wrong, was that there are some things we might want to formulate and impose generally on property owners, as opposed to simply waiting for the conveyance.
Yeah, so what I just pulled, you're right, was
that was
on the conveyance, and we can pull. I didn't hear a lot of interest for that, but I'm happy to pull for it. So if people are interested in having staff look at a measure that is retroactive for all properties, regardless of sale or
not all properties located within the WUI.
Okay, for properties located within the WUI, regardless of sale or any sort of other qualifying event, please raise your hand. Okay, I see 2 hands for that. So it looks like the staff focus will be on just the earlier pulled measure. Any other things before we wrap this up and move on to landscaping? Okay.
Lauren, can I?
Yes.
Sorry, just real briefly. I just on this vote we just took. This is such a big policy and such a big idea, and I just want to make the comment that I vote no because I worry that we are not scoped for this. What's going to take away? Maybe at the midterm check-in or at the next council. This is the kind of thing I would love us to be on the board for looking, across trade-offs. But I feel like I want to say that's. It's not no vote is not that this isn't important. And I'm sorry if I just triggered a whole thing, but
yeah. And we're not necessarily voting on this. We're definitely not voting on this. We are just signaling support for staff time to be spent investigating this. I see that that made two hands go away. So on that note, I will, I would like to see us move into our landscaping. I don't know, Nuria, if you want to start us off with that.
I'm actually gonna pass the baton back to Lisa.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
All right, Council, I am still Lisa Hood, Principal City Planner for Development Services, with part 2 of this presentation on waterwise landscaping. So the project purpose as we've scoped it so far for this part of the priority is to evaluate our existing landscaping regulations, policies, and programs in how they're meeting the goal of water conservation, and exploring updates that we can make that would further support water conservation through our landscaping practices, as well as looking at our educational programs and incentives for community members. It's important to note that this project will also involve the local government implementation of another recent state bill that was passed this year that prohibits certain landscaping practices in support of water conservation goals. So what this bill that was passed this year does, it applies to specific areas and uses in the city. So in street rights of way and other transportation corridors for commercial uses, property with commercial uses like retail businesses, offices, industrial uses, institutional uses, and what the state calls common interest communities, which we can think of as kind of like the common space of an HOA. In all of those areas, based on the state bill, the city cannot install ourselves or permit others to install on new development or redevelopment non-functional turf, artificial turf, or invasive plant species. And what the bill defines non-functional turf as is that turf grass that is not located in a recreational use area or other space that's regularly used for civic, community, or recreational purposes. And so while we already had this council priority, we also got this state bill at the same time that happens to be.
Can I jump in real quick, Lisa? It seems like your audio is catching a little bit. It might, maybe your internet is slow. If you needed to turn off your video to make sure that your audio flows smoothly, please feel free to do so.
Thanks for letting me know that. And let me know if it's still having an issue. All right, so that's the state bill overview. The schedule for this project is similar to the wildfire hardening project, aiming to complete by the end of next year. We've been doing scoping and research. Based on the direction that we get from you all tonight, we'll be analyzing different options at the beginning of next year. And then we're planning to come back for a check-in with council kind of mid next year with more detail on the various options, and then having those actual land use code changes and the engagement window in kind of late summer, early fall of next year. And that's where the two projects again come back together, is those land use code changes would incorporate both the wildfire hardening and waterwise landscaping changes. As far as engagement plan for this project, we're also looking at a consult level of engagement, although I do want to highlight that because part of this project will involve implementation of a state bill, that engagement would be focused more on an informed level because there's less flexibility in how we would be able to implement that since it's a state requirement. We also have great community engagement that was done for the recent water efficiency plan that the city adopted just within the last year or so that we will be able to utilize to inform this project as well. And we'd be doing regular engagement with our planning board and water resources advisory board throughout the life of this project, as well as numerous other engagement strategies. And again, we'll be refining that engagement plan based on the direction tonight. All right, so similar to the last presentation, I want to give some background on the work that the city already does related to water conservation and also how landscapes are reviewed in the city of Boulder. Our water conservation program is primarily housed in our utilities department, but there are 4 main points and many other departments contribute to this. So there's kind of the foundational aspects of water conservation and water utilities, meters, billing, maintenance of our system, things like that. We also have a number of technical assistance and incentives We have a water efficiency fund. We have many resources and rebates for community members, as well as great programs like Garden in a Box and lawn replacement programs. We do education and outreach through Waterwise yard seminars and xeriscape demonstration gardens and a number of other outreach efforts. And then again, the focus of this project, similar to Wildfire, is on the rules and ordinances side of things, the regulatory side. And those would be our landscaping standards. And the landscape standards in our land use code have not been updated since 2003. So we're due for a comprehensive overview of our landscaping standards. The current landscape review process, how it works in the city, we have one full-time landscape architect, Chris Riccardello, who's on the call, and he...
Can you hear anything?
Oh, no. Can others hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, and I could hear Tara for a second as she popped onto the call. But please continue.
Okay, is the mic getting better?
Yes, it is much better.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right, so Chris Riccardello himself reviews 545 building permits a year, 132 planning cases, and he does 268 inspections after those plants are installed. And keep in mind that those inspections are only happening at the time of planting, and so that's between March and October. That's not even the full year. So it's a lot of work to review our current landscaping standards. The landscape plans are required for new construction, additions, and significant remodels. There's a bit of variation of which standards apply based on the project value. So smaller projects might not have to comply with the full set of standards, but in general, that's how that works. The later step of enforcement, that happens on a complaint basis. And we have two departments who deal with enforcement of landscaping standards. So planning and development services, code compliance officers take on certain types of violations, and then our police department, code enforcement, looks at other types of violations. I just wanted to show this graph, again, highlighting that we have not updated our landscaping code in over 20 years. But just looking at the water use, I think it's an important way to frame understanding the impact that this project can have, and also all of the other work that our water conservation work has achieved over time. You can see that water use has decreased over time. If we were to look at it per capita, it's actually reduced 30% in the last 20 years per capita for water use. But you can see that outdoor water use has remained kind of the same throughout this period. And so there hasn't been as much movement in outdoor water use as there has been in indoor water use. And so that's where there's a big opportunity to make some changes in our landscaping standards. I also wanted to show this graph, which shows the different use types. And so for our utility billing, this is different customer types, but for the purpose of land use code, it's different land use types. So you can see that single family residential uses about 40% of the city's water in an average year, and the multifamily is about a quarter. Commercial, industrial, and institutional amount for about a third, and then municipal services, parks and city is about 4%. And so this is important to understand just how the state bill applies, because the state bill will tackle just the commercial, industrial, and institutional and municipal side of things. So that's only about a third. And this is showing both indoor and outdoor water use. So you can think of it, since they're about half and half, about half of that would be the outdoor water use that would be impacted by landscaping standards and the implementation of the state bill. All right, so moving on to the evaluation. So this is going to have maybe a bit more detail than the wildfire hardening presentation had. We had the opportunity through that water efficiency fund that the utilities program offers to hire a consultant to help us with an evaluation. We have our consultant, Logan Burba from Martin & Wood Water Consultants, is here in case you have specific questions about water engineering, which I certainly am not an expert in. She is here as my phone a friend to answer any of those questions. But what they did for us is they completed an audit of all of our landscaping standards, looked at all the regulatory language that we have in the city. This was actually a task that was recommended in the water efficiency plan that was adopted. So lots of overlap with the council priorities. So they audited that. There's a lot, and they also looked at a literature review of more general documents about best practices for water-wise landscaping, especially in Colorado. There's a ton of great resources out there. So they looked at those. Then we also looked at 8 cities, mostly in Colorado, that have completed, that are comparable to Boulder and or have completed recent updates to their landscaping codes to understand what best practices there are. Also to understand what Boulder is already a leader in. Boulder was quite early in adopting xeriscaping principles, and so some of our existing turf restrictions are actually stricter than some communities have now 20 years later, but there are certainly places where water efficiency and landscaping standards have evolved significantly in the last 20 years since we updated the code. They prepared a number of recommendations for your consideration, which I'm going to give a summary of each one, and then that will tee up the questions for discussion. So in evaluating those best practices, they looked at 3 different categories of best practices in these other communities. Whether the standard they were looking at was foundational to typical landscaping code and supporting water efficiency, whether it really moved the needle on water efficiency, and then how it impacted the ecosystem services. So looking at it from a larger picture of supporting other environmental values or supporting a vibrant ecosystem. Another really important part of this evaluation was understanding and anticipating the level of effort for implementing and enforcing any of these best practices, because all of them sound like a good idea, but you have to understand the level of effort. Maybe it's not something that we can tackle every single one of these best practices, but we need to identify which of those are really going to make the most impact without negatively impacting other services that the city provides due to high level of effort or things like that. So I'm going to go through each one of those quickly. There's a lot more explanation in the consultant's report, which is attached to your memo. And then I'm happy to answer questions about any of them as well. I'm going to start with the lower effort type items. And what that really means is not that it's low effort, it's still effort. But that we would be able to do that with our existing staffing. As we move into the medium and high level of effort, that would require additional staffing to support successful implementation of those best practices. So the first one is the non-functional turf bill. It's a state requirement. There's a compliance date required by January 1st, 2026. So that aligns well with this council priority. Like I said, it only applies to certain types of uses. And as far as the 8 cities that we looked at, only the city of Aurora is already compliant with this requirement. So all the cities in Colorado are going to have to be within the next year, but so far Aurora is the only one that has that. Secondly is fire-wise standards. Again, a low level of effort in that we can use our existing staff, and the project aligns with the wildfire hardening support, but incorporating fire-wise standards, so those low flammability plant standards and plant requirements into the land use code. This could also look at differences for rock mulch and rock mulch allowance, and then whether we have different standards in the WUI. You can see on the right that about half of the cities that we looked at do incorporate those fire-wise or low flammability plant requirements. The next recommendation that our consultant found for your consideration is soil amendment and mulch standards. So this is something that was interesting in every single city that we looked at except Boulder. They had either soil amendment or mulch standards, and Boulder does not have either of them. And so when we're looking at these, most of these recommendations are really trying to do the same thing, which is set plants up for success, for them to successfully establish in Boulder and be able to conserve as much water as possible while also surviving. So soil amendment and mulch can be really important to ensuring the survival and establishment of those plants. So that would include creating soil standards that would require soil testing and soil amendment to for those new and redeveloped landscapes, and then having prescribed mulch standards and encourage the use of organic mulches, which are really valuable in conserving water. And then another recommendation is related to watering schedules. This is another one that many cities do that Boulder doesn't do, and that's considering designating a maximum number of days per week that each customer can water, and whether that's assigning certain days or to addresses or things like that, or having regulations about the time of watering. There's lots of different directions we could go in this. This could be something that maybe isn't regulatory, but is rather a recommendation, but just something for consideration that other cities do and are able to enforce as it is regulatory. Another recommendation is the temporary irrigation zone allowance. So this is more of providing flexibility for folks to have temporary irrigation systems, acknowledging that many of our native plantings or low water plantings, although eventually they will require very little supplemental irrigation, during the establishment period, they typically need additional irrigation. And so what these do in other communities is essentially allow for that increased irrigation for a certain period. And then potentially some cities require that those be pulled out, some do not. And we would likely want to retain the ability for re-irrigation in time of drought to reinvigorate plants. All right, so now we're moving into kind of the higher level of effort for these recommendations. This is called, in the memo, the Landscape Water Efficiency Standard. And what it does is, and it's something that we're seeing a lot of communities adopt, especially in more recent years. And what it does is assign a maximum, basically allotment of water that can be used on a site. And then as part of that, the city develops a really detailed plant list of, you know, these plants fall into a low water category, very low water category, things like that. And then within that limit, the landscape designers are able to pick and choose the plants that would fit into their landscape design within that allotment of how much water they're going to use. So that allows some flexibility where if the site, or if there's a desire to have turf grass or something, if it's a single family home on the site, but turf grass is a high water user, that would take up more of their allotment, and they might have to make some trade-offs with other plants, other high water use plants, in order to not max out. So some examples to just show how that works in other cities. The city of Aspen there's varying levels of complexity that this can have. You can kind of tell just by the visual that the city of Aspen is more complex than Broomfield, as it goes into water use category, irrigation category, a new word that I learned as part of this project, which is evapotranspiration of irrigation and irrigation efficiency, and all of that kind of metrics to understand the water usage that's going to happen on that site. Then you look at Broomfield, which is a simpler version of different hydro zones and their water use, how much space is used for those, and then how much water is needed. So in incorporating that into landscape standards, that could provide some additional guidance for how landscape plans are designed in Boulder. Finally, this is the last recommendation from the best practices evaluation, and that is professional training and certification. This is something we're seeing a lot of Colorado communities do. There are actually nationwide or regional training programs that a lot of these communities use, which makes for great consistency across the state. But it's essentially a training program that is focused on water efficient landscape and irrigation design and installation. And what we're looking at, these other cities that we've looked at, they vary in whether they require anyone submitting a landscaping plan or irrigation plan to the city has to be certified in order to do that, or it could just be a recommendation that they do that. And so we're seeing that become a lot more common. This, I would say, is a high level of effort because as we've talked to other communities to understand it, it does take staffing to have these trainings or participate in a regional training, as well as if there's a level of registration requirement that's required to submit plans. This could be something that would require significant numbers of staff, and then also as far as funding from an equity perspective, it would be a program that we would want to be able to offer at no cost, especially if it's a requirement for these landscaping and irrigation professionals. And so that would require a funding element as well. So those are the recommendations from our consultant's review of the evaluation. I've divided the questions kind of with graphics to remind you of the different parts of the presentation. I'm going to attempt to put my video back on, but let me know if the mic starts to cut out. But first question is, we would really love your feedback. These are best practices that we've seen in other communities, but in order to move forward on this project, we'd really like to hear if there are certain topics that you're interested in us looking more into, if there are some that maybe just doesn't sound like a good fit from the outset, so we shouldn't spend more time on it, or if there's anything that was missing that you'd like us to further look into. Second question is related to the state bill. Staff is recommending, and we described this more in the memo, just to further the impact on water conservation. Staff is recommending council consider applying it to the multifamily residential land use as well, so that it's over half of our water use would be impacted by that non-functional turf bill. And it would also add to some simplicity in the ease of review, especially as we get into those common interest communities that I talked about, where it could get kind of complex to slice and dice the different types of uses. And so these are the questions. I can take down the screen or keep the screen up if it's helpful, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Let's take down this slide so we can see each other. I'd like to start with any questions people have for staff based on the presentation. It was a wonderful presentation, but I'm sure my colleagues will still have some questions. Anyone want to start us off?
I think Aaron was first.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. There we go. I was having a little bit of problem with my Zoom. Okay, Aaron, and then I see Ryan, Nicole, Taisha, and Matt.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. And yeah, Lisa, thanks. That was really excellently presented and helped me follow along extremely well. Just a couple clarifying questions. One is a specific one on the watering schedules. Like a couple of the things that were mentioned, one was different days for different properties. And another one was just prohibiting irrigation usage during certain hours of the day, I guess, during certain times of the year. It strikes me as potentially that latter course being much simpler to adopt. You rated that as, I think, a medium complexity. Would it go to the lower end of medium if we went for blanket hours for the whole city versus implementing different days in different sections?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the idea with the medium level of effort is the enforcement aspect of that. So it would, in order to enforce that, I think that would be more challenging, but, and it depends, yeah, if it was time of day or week, that
Lisa,
would vary. But this is also where we haven't gotten too much in detail.
Yeah, we're losing you again. Do you mind turning your video off? I
yes.
didn't catch the last couple sentences.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I don't know what's going on with the internet. So the medium level of impact is more related to enforcement of that. And these are kind of just best guesses of how much effort. And so it just would take some additional staffing, either in utilities or planning and development. We'd have to determine the details of that in order to enforce either a time or day of week.
Got it. And then a follow-up question on that. So again, that makes sense that enforcement is where a lot of the time is placed. But would it be a little bit easier on the enforcement if it were blanket across the city versus different days in different places?
Lisa, can I jump in on that?
Yeah, please.
Very recently, I was able to share that some jurisdictions actually have dropped their daily restriction, in part for the reason that you're mentioning, Mayor. And so if it was just the time of day, that is a less of an enforcement challenge than trying to regulate the days of the week kind of thing.
Okay, thanks for that, Brad. And then the other thing is, so we're seeing the different levels of difficulty here, but we're not in a budget discussion today. Neri, I believe you've described our budget situation as constrained.
I believe so.
So, if we said, yeah, do it all, we don't actually have the money to do that, right? So, like, to what extent do we have the flexibility to say, we like these, but implement them as we have the funding, or put them on a plan for when we do have the funding? Or, Neri, this might be a question for you.
I appreciate that. I mean, and Brad, correct me if I'm wrong, as we get a little bit more information and we come back, and some of them are already going to come back to you with trade-offs, so we build some of that out. I think as we learn more of what your desires are, then the next question will be that budget conversation. We have not built that into the 2025 budget, which we just passed. So the quickness and the determination of what you want to move forward, we will need to bring for next year's budget. And then we will have that conversation on what you're willing to fund or not within our as we present what we have available. So it really will just depend on the menu of items that you as a council body want to move forward.
Yeah, and I'll just add to Nuria's comment to say that some of these just mechanically and logistically would also take time to stand up, say, a new program. So it would actually probably, in some scenarios, spread out over several budget year discussions.
Okay, that's helpful to understand. Thank you. And then the last one was, I know our second question that we'll be looking at is whether we apply some of the non-functional turf requirements to additional areas. Have we thought as well as applying some of that to new single-family construction? I mean, we don't get much of that, but like, say, in the strip in front of the like the front yard area, for example, versus like, say, the backyard where you might be more active.
You know, yeah. I don't know that we have talked about that, and Lisa, maybe you can correct me on that. I would point out to your statement there, Mayor, that we get a very small number of those, and I guess just off the top of my head, I would worry about kind of creating that discrepancy in the community that would be a little hard to track. But we certainly could look into that. And Lisa, am I correct that we didn't really talk about that in other context?
We have talked about it.
Okay.
But one of the things that the evaluation was helpful, as I mentioned, is that Boulder does already have some turf restrictions for residential. So we've had that for 20 years already. So we're already far ahead, a little bit farther ahead than other communities. But we'd certainly be looking, as we look at all of the landscaping standards, about how to beef that up for the single family residential side. Some of the communities that have the more black and white restriction of not having turf in the front yard, things like that, which I know Castle Rock had, is now in the process of removing that. And so it's not something necessarily, I think that could be implemented more successfully as maybe a percentage, which is how we have it now, a percentage of the site for a single family could be turf rather than, front yard versus backyard, just to provide flexibility.
If you tell me we've already got some provisions for it, that's good enough for me. Thanks for the answer. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron, Nicole, and then Taisha.
Thank you. And thanks, Lisa, for the great presentation memo. My question was really similar to Aaron's. And so rather than re-ask it, the other thing that comes to mind is we're making some, likely making some changes around single family zoning and things like that. I mean, if we are applying the non-functional turf standards to multifamily residential, how does that kind of intersect with some of this work we're doing to get into compliance with some of the state laws around allowing a little more density in some of the single family areas?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the way that the building code separates, I don't think they call it single family, multifamily, but you get into commercial level of construction past 4 units. And so likely we would use that same dividing line where 1, 2, 3 unit buildings would have the same requirements, and then 4 units and above would fall into that multifamily definition.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Next we have Taisha and then Matt.
I'm just gonna co-sign. The mayor already asked my questions about the budget, so really just getting that fiscal note and that information, because a lot of these I would be really interested in. So just knowing what the cost is, and based on the conversation we just had that it's going to be a year out, that I'm also interested in like prioritization levels related to cost. So that's all. Thank you. Oh, and then communication to renters. I just feel like this is a very landowner conversation, and just as a renter, I don't think, I think there could be more information and consideration of how we communicate, and also just predicting costs also is something I think that is a major consideration. Because when you go up, oh, sure, yeah, water more, but then you go up a whole water tier, and that's a lot of money. And so I just wanted to put that in there. Thank you.
Thanks, Taisha. Matt?
Appreciate that. Now I'll just throw a disclaimer. I did go camera off because I had to step out for just a hot minute. So if this was addressed, just quickly cut me off and say it was done. But this is a little bit of piggybacking off what Aaron said. And I guess my general question is, if we were to sort of force everyone to irrigate at certain times of day, do we run into any water pressure issues by the street, neighborhood, or city level if everybody's doing it all at once?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can point to Joanna Bloom from Utilities is here, and she can add something. Maybe I should turn off my camera. I want to make sure you guys can see that I'm nodding and listening to you. So what that would be actually one of the benefits of assigning specific days to different addresses is that most people, or a lot of people, choose to water Mondays at 5 a.m. And so there's some issues with that already. And so by dividing that out, there could be a greater differentiation, but I'll let Joanna talk about that since that's more her area of expertise.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. I'm Joanna Bloom. I'm a deputy director over in utilities, and yeah, pressure and treatment plant concerns are something that we would have to figure out how to manage. I don't think they're insurmountable, but they are issues that we would have to consider.
Okay. My second question was going to be for utilities anyway, which related to this is, if we're looking at curbing water usage, I think we're not far off or pretty close to doing a new rate base study. So how would we use an enhanced and tiered rate base and escalating premium for that, for extra water use? And I only think of that as because there's a number of folks who grow their own food. And so creating these restrictions would then diminish their capacity to do that. And we want people to grow their own food because they're not coming from other areas. It's local, it's nearby, it's organic. So I want to make sure that we're not competing against our values in that sense. So I'm just sort of curious if you could shed light on the rate-based study and where and when that may come to be.
Yeah, so we do have as a 2025 work plan item, starting with a rate study. It's really probably going to be in 2 phases because we currently have existing water budgets that would really inform a second phase that would be a rate study. And our existing water budgets, they've been in place for over a decade, and it's time to kind of reevaluate and see how they apply. And there are certainly trade-offs and how we want to influence behavior and what we're comfortable saying that folks can and can't do. And so that would be a bigger process. It is slated for the 2025 work plan. So more to come on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Tina, you're up next.
Yeah, I am also interested in the growing your own food and how that interacts with water rates. And I don't know if that's a stated value in the city of Boulder or a priority, but it would be good to point to that if we have that discussion. The other piece is when we remove turf, if the city could help people understand how we cannot create more of a heat island, since turf has some cooling impacts, and especially when we think about areas that are multi-story buildings that might be in heat islands already. So just trying to see how people living in those places won't be experiencing more heat, but rather less or the same. And that's a question I have, whether we're addressing that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of great work being done in our climate initiatives department, and I would invite them to speak up with anything about the urban heat island work. But that is a concern with the non-functional turf bill, that we are anticipating some best practices guidance and technical assistance from the state, since that will be implemented statewide, of what kind of similar to what we had talked about with the wildfire hardening, what can be used in place of turf grass that can achieve some of those climate benefits, while improving the urban heat island effect, but not be such a heavy water user as turf is.
And then I had a really specific question. When we're talking about removing non-essential turf, and we look at a property like the Flatiron Park on 55th, is most of that, there's a lot of turf there, is most of it non-essential, or is some of it designated as park?
So for the most part, parks that are used for civic or recreational purposes would be considered functional turf, so that wouldn't fall under the bill. There is some nuance there in the state bill, so as we apply that to our local standards, we're hoping we can have a more clear definition of non-functional turf. So maybe we can parse that out more than the state bill, which is essentially not an area that has a function.
Right, because I mean the Flatiron Park is just, it's offices, but there's just
I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's a lot of turf in the medians and all around it. And so I was just kind of curious, like how we're engaging with owners there, because it would be a pretty heavy lift to change that, I think, which I'm not opposed to it, but I just want to make sure we're thinking about what that timeline looks like.
Yeah, sorry, I went way down the park road.
Yeah, it's like a terrible example.
No, so. I heard park and I started going down there. Yeah, so we would have to kind of similar to the wildfire hardening, we'd have to determine at what point new landscaping requirements would be triggered. As far as non-functional turf, it does say in the bill that any redevelopment they can maintain existing turf, but if they are going to redevelop, then it cannot be replaced with non-functional turf. And so because that's a commercial and industrial office park, the non-functional turf bill would apply. So at any point when they have to come in for a permit, and then there can be some further nuances that we can determine, like what types of permits would qualify as redevelopment, essentially.
And then finally, and I'm sorry, this is a really basic question, but when we talk about turf, are we also thinking about ground covers like clover, or will there just be a lot of specificity to what kind of green ground cover might be replaced or not replaced?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, it's more of the Kentucky bluegrass and fescue type of turf that are really heavy water users. And not so much, but that's again where we can get into more specificity than what the state bill says. And we're hoping to create a consolidated plant list and more definitive guidance on, there's been a lot of advancements in low water turf. I don't know if there's one called Tahoma 31 that people are using that's really low water use. So we'll be able to add more definition to that as we develop a plant list and landscaping standards.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Tina. I have a couple of questions myself. So let's see. As we think about outreach and engagement in education, I'm wondering, do we have targeted efforts where we look at properties based on water usage to identify kind of maybe properties that are using disproportionately large amounts of water for outreach and engagement and education activities?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll bring Joanna Bloom for that one.
Yeah, so I would say our water budgets are the primary mechanism that we try to notify people of getting into that realm of higher than desired water use. That's really the main mechanism we have in communicating with people. We do try to do through our water conservation partners, do audits and things like that can help people that are interested in conserving come up with some programs. And I'll just invite either Kim Hutton or Crystal Morey to add anything else to that are also here supporting the conversation that I might have missed.
Good evening, Council. I'm Kim Hutton, Water Resources Manager. I think Joanna captured it really well. We've got some programs that we initiate through the Water Conservation Program where we are looking at the higher water users, and we're doing targeted outreach to those higher water users, primarily through the commercial, industrial, institutional sector. Thank you. Appreciate that. One of the things that I notice in commercial landscape, which tends to be most commercial projects have more landscaping projects often than residential. I don't see a lot of native grass plantings, sort of that more like field of native grasses rather than like clumps of often not native grasses. Would you say that is that something that we're seeing because of the regulations we have in place, or would that kind of planting easily fall under what is allowed or encouraged by our current regulations?
This is a great opportunity to bring Chris Ricardello, our landscape architect, to share his expertise.
Good evening, council members. Chris Ricardello, Principal Landscape Architect, City of Boulder, Planning and Development Services. Would you mind, Lauren, restating your question?
Yeah, so I was wondering about sort of native grasses and if those are, I don't often see them in places that I believe follow our landscaping standards. And I'm wondering if that is because they are sort of discouraged based on some rule or intricacy in our landscaping standards, or if they're just not preferred by people who are installing or, designing and
it's a good question.
Purchasing landscapes.
Often larger commercial projects, whether they're triggering landscape improvements or not is a question. If it's a brand new commercial project, commercial or say an office project or a research project, we are working actively with a number of applicants to actually refine the landscape standards within that property, the way they're designed. So I'm working with landscape architects for the most part to try to meet our landscape standards. And we have limitations on turf grass. Obviously 25% of the landscape area is the maximum we can allow for turf grass. But in terms of natives, often those projects and those designers do incorporate quite a few natives. Sometimes it takes a little while to get those established and to get the landscape mature. So am I answering your question? I'm walking around it just a little bit. I apologize for that, but it's a complex issue. Like I said, many of the projects that are out there currently have established landscape that's existed for some time that might be modified with new work or new proposals. But oftentimes we do absolutely direct them to use the native grasses, native materials.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have another question for you, probably. What would you recommend in terms of helping us keep our street trees alive? It feels like a big issue that we have where newly planted street trees often do not make it into their prime.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wish forestry were here. They might be the absolute experts on this subject. However, I'm obviously reviewing and inspecting street trees. And there are a number of issues that are happening, and it's not an easy subject to try to figure out what's killing some of the street trees. Oftentimes it can be the work itself from landscape contractors and an inability to plant them properly. And then we'll see some mortality from those trees over several years. You might be seeing that. And oftentimes, similarly, there may be maintenance issues in terms of irrigation where all it takes in the middle of the summertime is to turn off that irrigation or have it left off inadvertently for 2 weeks and those trees are going to die. And it just takes a little time. So it's unfortunate, but it does happen. Otherwise, in terms of morphology and trying to figure out exactly botanically why they're dying is another story. and probably one that I should really redirect to forestry should they receive the question.
I appreciate you taking a try at it.
Sure.
And if forestry has more comments that they would like to share with us, I would love it through email if they're not here tonight. And then let's see. One of the things I also notice is that where I've seen commercial projects that they're, are doing enough modifications that they have to come into compliance with the landscaping standards, that only lasts for a couple of years. And often I see rock mulch going back in, I see different plantings than what were initially put in, because it doesn't seem like, especially in areas like our parking lot, tree islands, and often kind of our more landscape with high foot traffic kind of areas and things like that, that sometimes there isn't a lot of durability. Are we reaching out to those property owners to understand why they're maybe installing new landscapes that aren't compliant with our standards, so that we can, I guess I'm concerned because people are making this investment, it's kind of failing, and then I see them trying something different that isn't compliant. And if there's a good reason for that, I would like to understand what it is and maybe change rules to make sure that what we're requiring of people has long-term durability.
Yes, we certainly do look retroactively at existing landscapes to see if they are in compliance. Oftentimes it takes a level of enforcement or review time that can be taxing on the landscape staff, which is me. So it takes a little while to try to do that, but we have been doing that successfully. Land use code actually requires that all property owners that have an active landscape plan that was approved through one of the land use processes, that they are required to actually maintain all plant material that was approved. So if any of them go back through and remove plant material or take it out, whether it's because of maintenance issues or just mortality or that sort of thing, then they are required to replace it in kind unless they come back in with a new landscape plan. Whether a landscape was originally considered durable or not is a good question. Almost nothing is durable when you have foot traffic or any kind of traffic or even chemical issues in terms of snow removal and ice removal chemicals, that sort of thing. Oftentimes we'll have difficulty trying to maintain some of those landscapes. And that's something we probably need to have a look at in terms of what would be considered durable, especially for parking lots. Does that cover your question?
Yeah, I appreciate that answer. Lisa, I see you're
I'm just
back.
turning on my video for a second to let you know when to talk. But I think that also speaks to the potential opportunity with the certification program. And again, many of the recommendations in making sure that the establishment is successful of plants. And so if something is installed by someone who understands the correct way to irrigate and install those plants, then it has a much better chance of survival. That's just something we don't have right now, is the ability to educate all of the different contractors who are doing that in the way to install things in a way that's going to bear the test of time, as well as soil amendment and mulch and all of these other things that would support the health of the plant into the future.
Thank you for that, Lisa. Does anyone else have any additional questions, or should we move? Looks like we could move on to our first question from staff, which is, does council have feedback on staff's recommendations, considerations for this scope of work? And I heard primarily getting an understanding of which of these areas we would really like to see, or in which ones we are not interested in moving forward. I see Nicole's hand up.
Yes, thanks for the question. So the things that I was particularly interested in We're constructing a list of recommended plants and things to include. Education for landscapers, incentives for everyone involved. I think incentives are generally a great way to go. Anything that's consistent and aligned with our water efficiency plan, specifically targeting some of the policies within that plan, especially since it had so much engagement that went along with it. Also, anything that overlaps with our fire mitigation efforts, those would have priority for me. Just sort of a general theme on the things that interested me is really anything that helps people help themselves and aligns with our sustainability, equity, resilience framework as well. I'm not super interested in adding a lot of enforcement requirements from a constrained budget and resource perspective. So I would love to stay away from those. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. I see Aaron next.
It is were great comments, Nicole. Thanks. I guess I might look at this at certainly the easy ones. Please polish them off as you have time. And it seems like with the medium to the hard ones, I would look to staff maybe to come back with maybe a sequencing and length of time and what's potentially doable from a budget perspective. I think you have a lot of good ideas here. Like other jurisdictions have implemented a lot of best practices that we haven't gotten to yet, and I'd love to see us catch up. But I'd be interested in staff's kind of prioritization and thoughts on how to accomplish that. And just the one other thing I would throw in there is that the professional training and certification does seem like a really big lift from like a staff resources and time perspective. So like that one, it was unclear to me that it would ever be worth the trade-off for the amount of time and money that it would take. But for the other ones, I'd be interested in staff suggested sequencing as we have resources available. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. Matt?
I appreciate that. I think the question I keep coming back to for myself, and I don't know how we reconcile this, is the competing interests. And I'm not saying like economically, but leaving leaf cover down is good for soil health, but it's bad for fire mitigation, right? And certain things we do for stone or rock is good for fire mitigation, but bad for our climate and heat island effect, right? And so we have these, and so I don't know how we find balance in that. And I don't, maybe we won't, but I just keep coming back to how do we do that? Because they become mutually exclusive at some point, and someone may value one more than the other. And I don't know to what extent we dictate those terms. Maybe in the WUI, we've determined it's one way, and in other areas, there's more flex. I don't know the answer, but I just see that those conflicts could paralyze us from actually making a decision one way or the other. And then we're kind of just sort of trying to manage everything. So I don't know how to get there, but that's I don't know how we do that.
Thanks, Matt. I have some comments that relate to that, so I'll call myself next. I think sort of because of that intrinsic, that sometimes there are trade-offs that we can't really avoid. They just are intrinsically trade-offs between things. I'm not as interested in an all-out prohibition on things. I think that maybe limiting the amount, the percentage of area that can be used for particular things is a good way to deal with that. I liked the idea of allowing, rock mulch around, directly around a house or foundation to help create that fire break. There might be other places where that makes sense, like along the base of a fence or something like that. So I think allowing some flexibility while still pushing people towards the majority of the landscape being in a more climate friendly direction is what I would like to see in going that way, along with other things that are sort of bigger changes that aren't necessarily addressed in this. In our parking lot standards in general, I kind of question whether having these little tiny strips that are hard to plant is always the right direction in terms of trying to create space that really can make sense for plantings, you know, as you talked about, it's difficult when you're talking about de-icing and high foot traffic for a lot of plants to survive that kind of environment. And maybe it makes sense to have more consolidated larger areas of plantings. I would also like to see us increase kind of the educational aspect on our water billing. So having more push. I remember when I used to live in Eugene, where we had municipal electric, you would get things like, you are, you know, using 20% more electricity than your neighbors, you know, and kind of like these little pushes to encourage people to make reductions. And they tailored them based on, you know, what they thought was most likely to decrease usage regardless of what your usage was. I like the soil amendment recommendations and potentially testing, although I wouldn't recommend that for permit, but maybe at CO or permit closeout. And it could be something that ties into that professional training and certification. I did like that idea. I know it's expensive, but if that could potentially replace some of the other areas where staff is spending time on projects, maybe it makes sense, maybe with certification that alleviates some other kinds of permit reviews or something like that, to make it so that there's an incentive but not a requirement for training and certification. And where we really are trusting people once they are certified to follow through with that, and maybe making their certification, being able to hold it contingent on not breaking those rules. Like we talked about earlier, a simple Firewise standard would be great. And oh, this is the next question. Yeah, that's it for me. I see Taisha.
Thank you. I echo a lot of actually all of the comments and recommendations on that as well. Hello. Uh-oh. Okay, you can get perfect. My question was more about more from a connectivity perspective. So, and like habitat connectivity perspective. So, you know, I was kind of thinking more so like east. I've noticed east of Foothills. I was looking at the Nature Conservancy's what is it? Their Metro Denver Regional Conservation Assessment. And for our area, they just like, you know, have maybe about 30% of our area they have as kind of habitat low connectivity. So it kind of got me thinking about some of the measures and metrics that we're using for this. And just from that quality perspective, just, you know, I would like to think about how that was being addressed. And then the other piece was just water reuse. That's just in general. Wanted to lift that up as something. I'd be curious if that had been discussed or is being considered.
Yeah, it's not, oh, sorry. I don't know if utilities wants to answer that about the water reuse.
I do know that there is an opportunity coming up coming from the state about looking at gray waters, and municipalities will have to decide how that fits into their community. So that's something on the horizon that we'll need to look at here in the next year or two. And I think I'll leave it there. I know Kim probably has more to add, but I think there's more conversation to come on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't see any more comments related to item 1. So I think we can move into item 2. Does council support expanding the applicability of the state?
I'm sorry, Lauren, they answered the water reuse question, but not the habitat connectivity question.
Sorry about that. Jonathan Cohn from Climate Initiatives is here, and I know they do a lot of work on habitat connectivity, so I think he would be the best one to answer that.
Awesome. And specifically the intersection, right, with the landscaping component, right? And it also kind of connects with Lauren's question about like how the quality of what's being planted like isn't good, then it doesn't help us.
Good evening, members of council. Jonathan Cohn with Climate Initiatives. Thanks, Lisa, for calling on me. I've been listening intently. Great conversation. Councilmember Adams, appreciate the question. You and I have had some conversation about this very issue, and I think there are a number of things that we want to think about with respect to the connectivity. And I think what you're getting to is deeply rooted in our discussions around Cool Boulder, obviously connected canopies and pollinator corridors, and thinking about kind of going back to, I think, one of the comments that Councilmember Folkerts made about, or I guess it was Councilmember Benjamin, about kind of the competing trade-offs and thinking about if we want to do something, as an example, with rockscaping. Obviously, you do that incorrectly, it can increase surface temperatures and air temperatures by over 5 degrees. And we know that that heat persists after the sun goes down. So how do we think about supporting native ecosystems in through this process? And the way we have been thinking about that through our work is prioritizing climate positive design. And that's where I think there's going to be a really great connector between the work that we're doing in nature-based solutions and thinking about those trade-offs, making sure that we are not creating those unintended consequences and diminishing or impacting our pollinators and that biodiversity, which is so critical in the climate space, while also addressing the issues that we know are so critical around heat and, of course, around water and around fire mitigation. So I don't have the perfect answer for you, except to say that we're really starting to explore deeply into that point of intersection and know that that's going to be how we think about developing incentive structures and ongoing strategies and programs across the departments.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And again, I think it's that, how to, that where program becomes policy, where we're embedding it, where it just becomes practice, is really where I'm excited to get those policy recommendations. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And now I think we can move on to question 2. Yes. Okay. Does City Council support exploring expanding the applicability of the state bill prohibition on non-functional turf, artificial turf, and invasive plants to apply to all new multifamily residential development, in addition to the commercial, institutional, common interest communities and industrial uses as required by the bill? Take us away, Aaron.
You want to just straw poll this one, Lauren? I'm certainly in favor, but maybe we could be quick about this.
Okay, yeah, I think that sounds like a great recommendation. So everyone who is in, Nicole, do you need to have a comment first, or can I straw poll this?
It could either be before or after. It does relate to it, but
Great,
just
go for it.
Comment as well. And just a thinking about the engagement. And so first of all, supportive of exploring this, but thinking about the engagement, I know one of the big engagement strategies was to look back at the water efficiency plan engagement, which I'm in favor of because that was a more comprehensive engagement process. My question is, if we're moving in that direction, does that change anything around the engagement, initial thinking about the engagement strategy for this work? Just because if we're now pulling in multifamily housing, did we get a lot of folks kind of responding in that group earlier? And especially, and there was a comment about reusing the Be Heard Boulder respondents who had responded to the water efficiency plan. And I'm just curious to what degree people in multifamily housing were represented there, to Taisha's comment about renters and how they're being brought into this work.
Yeah, my understanding is we did get a good number of responses to the water efficiency plan and input from that, but I'll double check on that. But this is where it gets good. It's a good opportunity to talk about the difference between consult level of engagement and inform. So like I said, the implementation of the state bill is truly an inform level of engagement because there's not wiggle room. The wiggle room is applying this to multifamily. And so that's where we would have to step up into a consult level of engagement. We'll certainly use the input that was received for water efficiency as it is applicable, but if we need to expand that and build on that, we will to align with the potential to explore multifamily residential.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa.
And I guess I have a question related to that as well. So the state law only applies to new construction, is that correct?
It's also redevelopment.
And redevelopment, okay. Yeah. But we, as a city, have already our sort of stricter landscaping requirements would also apply to new or significant redevelopment. Correct. Is there a big gap between what our current standards would require and what this new state law would require?
I think in simplest terms, so you heard Chris mention that we have a 25% maximum of turf grass right now, and the state bill would allow 0% of turf grass, and so that would be the difference. So although we already, and that's in those certain uses, so although we already have fairly strict standards compared to others, the state bill is going to be stricter on non-functional turf than we currently have.
Okay, thank you for that. And I guess maybe I have one more follow-up question. Do we feel like we have good alternatives for turf grass in terms of creating sort of that kind of cooling area for recreation that often turf grass provides?
I think we'll need to do some more research on that. I'm sure others in other departments might have already done this and be able to answer this question better. But like I said, we'll have technical assistance from the state with best practices recommendations. And there are a number of new lower water use turf grass alternatives that have been coming online in the last few years. So I think that we'll be able to get there and determine that kind of recommended plant list for alternatives.
Okay, great. Thank you. So with that, everyone who is in favor of expanding the state bill to include multifamily housing, please raise your hand. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, Matt, was your hand up? You're behind a thing on my screen. Yes, perfect. Thank you. Okay, 8. So it looks like that is something we're interested in having staff explore. Thank you so much for this presentation, Lisa, and for all of your work on both of these items. Thank you, Nuria, for letting us squeeze 2 items into one. And with that, I would like to move on to our final topic of the night, which is reaffirming council's commitment to council rules of procedure. So this was an item that was brought forward by Councilmember Benjamin in a hotline. And so I will turn it over to him to explain what he is asking for from us and how we would move, what decision we need to make on this item. Thank you.
Appreciate it, Lauren. So thanks for the opportunity to bring this up. You know, I find it interesting. I mean, self-governance, being a self-governing body, and good governments are always a council priority, regardless if we state it at a retreat, because there is no one to manage us but us. So on Halloween, interestingly enough, not that this is a scary topic, it shouldn't be, but I sent a hotline out, really sort of centered on a council training that I participated in regarding our council rules. It was really just to sort of go in depth and have the assistance of our city attorney and staff go through and really dive deep into what is a 70-page, when you look at it, right? I mean, it's not a small document.
to just look at it and learn more about it and how we interpret those rules and where are they clear, where are they maybe not. And what came out of that was really three things that for me, I was sort of surprised by, that there were really three rules that one of which we don't follow really much at all. And the other two were sort of inconsistent with. And so I just thought, since we're a self-governing body, I wanted to put it out there and say, hey, these are areas that I've noticed that we're not on this, we're not following our rules as we have them written. And this is a chance to reaffirm them and kind of say, hey, look, going forward, we're going to do our best and hold ourselves accountable to following the rules that we've set forth for ourselves. Because without rules, we lose the ability to have fair treatment among ourselves. And it also sets some inequities with regards to some people maybe feeling like they've got more or less influence in a situation or on a particular issue. And so that's really what I wanted to bring up. Just make sure here's a moment. Hey, we're not doing that great here. If we have questions about them, we can raise that. And then that reaffirmation allows us to sort of move forward in a way that we can all move collaboratively and in an even space going forward. So that was the purpose of that. And the three ones that I brought up were with regards to our procedures around how we interact as a council body of open comment, not community, but how we at the dais deal with open comment, how we utilize our CAC requests, and how we utilize hotline in really the core function of directing staff and getting into those areas where we might be asking staff to do more than they really should be doing without a nod of 3 or nod of 5, and getting into those sort of sticky situations. So those are the three. And so I just wanted to bring that up for discussion and see if anyone else has any comments or add or pieces like that. But I didn't want to dominate the whole conversation. I want to turn it over to sort of those pieces based on that. And then we can add some commentary and certainly ask Teresa for some guidance on how we interpret and move forward with some of those rules. So I'll just sort of leave it there and see if there's questions or comments and if people want to take it from there.
Okay, I see Tina.
Yeah, first I just wanted to ask, with hotline in particular, do we feel like, is there a mechanism for staff to flag hotlines that are too much work, that really need a nod of 3? Is that, because I wouldn't know that. I can't govern other people's hotlines because I don't know which information is at the ready and which information takes research. So do we have, like, so is there one option for us to affirm that we respect the hotline, and also staff that we encourage them to kick them back if they think it needs a nod of 3?
I see Teresa, ready to answer that?
Yeah, so currently, thanks for that. Currently in the council handbook, there are some guidelines for hotlines. It does point us back to the rule of 3 and rule of 5. Rule of 3 being for research requests that are going to take more than 3 hours. Those require 3 council members' assent. For things that are significant work and potentially new work, those would require a nod of 5. So that is in the current council handbook. I would say that it's not something that we flag very often, though, as staff, and something that we probably could do a better job of doing.
So yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, Nuria, sorry.
Sorry, I just might add, and what Teresa has added is all correct. I would add too that when it does come to that, and we are trying to reinforce that with our own team, because we are pleasers, and when you ask us to do something, we want to nod into that with due respect to that pleasing component. I have asked staff to really think about that when there is a request, to bring it back. And so when we do see that, what we try to do is to bring that forward to CAC. So that is the process. When we hear from you, whether it's through indirectly, and we hope that that is the chance for hotline to be used, we come to you, and we will do that more proficiently. As Teresa says, we could do a better job of that, is to come to you and bring that to CAC for a discussion.
Okay, that's helpful. And that's for me, the missing link is just making sure that we know when we need to be kicking it over to a nod of 3 or 5.
Thank you, Tina. I see Nicole.
Yeah, first of all, just thank you, Matt, for bringing this up. Some of this I have been wanting us to talk about as a group for the entire time I've been on council. So I'm kind of excited to have some of it come up here. You know, I think some of this in the the training discussion, one of the things that came out was that one of the biggest challenges that we have as a governing body is getting through everything that we need to get through, both the ambitious work plan priorities that we set together as a council every 2 years, but also just the work that we're required to do and where staff needs us to help out with some of the citywide strategic priorities that they're working on, as well as just things we have to do, like the landmarks stuff and things like that. And you know, I think for me, coming out of that training, one of the things that I was thinking about was how are we deciding together how we're spending the time that we have together and the very little amount of spare time that we have. And so, I think even in thinking about CAC requests for a few years, what I've been wanting us to do is to, at the start of every year, be intentional about what the additional topics are that we want to add to our schedule as any additional space arises. And so in my time on CAC last year, just kind of observing and then jumping in a little more, it was really thinking about how are we, how can we keep our requests focused on the council priorities and the citywide work that we have to do. But I think that this extends to kind of all thinking about all the time that we have together and how we are using that time, and also just giving CAC what they need to schedule things appropriately so that we get out of our meetings on time. And to the I mentioned this at maybe it was at the training, but just even in thinking about, responding to open comment, which, I think we all do at various times, but like, how are we making it clear that that's what we're going to do so that CAC knows to build that time in as we are thinking about the agenda? How do we kind of get to a place where we are being intentional about scheduling the time that we are using in meetings so that we can stay on track and not have what happened like last week, where I think nearly all of us weighed in after the open comment, and then when it got to the point where we needed to make a decision on one of the public hearings, it was so late, and at least 5 of us were very tired and feeling like we couldn't make an appropriate decision at that point in the night. So I think, when I think about some of these things that help us work more efficiently, just thinking about how can we plan our time together so that we really are focusing on all the things that we that we have committed to staff and to the community that we're going to be working on.
Thank you, Nicole. I also wonder, so I have Matt's hotline pulled up, and I was wondering, Teresa, because I think it is helpful to see the sections of code that are included in that, if that is something I might be able to copy into the chat for us to see, or if that would be problematic.
That would be fine.
Okay. Just so that we all have access to that, I'm going to copy that into the chat. And Tara, I saw you had your hand up. You're welcome to.
I did. Do you want it first copied into the chat? Because
no,
I was actually going to say, we all talked for a very long time. Can you all hear me? Because I'm trying a new headset. Yeah, okay. We all talked for a really long, I made a little speech. Other people made speeches, so that made that meeting go so long. And I wanted to know exactly what does it say about what we should be doing after open comment. So that's what you have up here. So that's good. So
happy to address that if you'd like.
That would be great.
Yeah. So in your council procedure, under section 4, council meeting agenda, A2F provides that at the conclusion of open comment, the presiding officer may ask city staff for any response to matters raised during open comment. So may ask city staff for a response. At the conclusion of the staff response, any council member may ask that the original speaker be recalled to reply to the staff response. Such comment shall be limited to 1 minute. That is the only provision for any response after open comment at that time. So when council wishes to comment on things that were brought up in open comment, that falls under section 4. A eight, which is matters from the mayor and members of city council, which provides in relevant part. At this point, any council member may place before the council matters which are not included in the formal agenda. This item is generally limited to responses to open comment. And so responses to open comment should actually be coming under matters from the mayor and the city council toward the end of the meeting.
Point of clarification. Is there a time limit attributed to that?
That's a great question, Taisha. There is no time limit. There is no time limit provided in that procedure.
Thank you.
It does. Nope, not for that portion.
Thank you for that. I see Tina and then Mark.
Yeah, so should we talk about that particular rule now about response to public comment under matters? Is that what we're contemplating?
I think
open comment, to be clear.
Yeah. Thank you.
Discussing sort of broadly at this moment, but I would like to get us to narrow in, and then I was imagining that we might sort of straw poll on whether we want to recommit to following the rules as they are laid out in our handbook, or because some of these are ones that we are not typically following, we could also say that we choose not to, that we choose to continue as we are.
Yeah.
Teresa, hold on. Teresa, could you give us guidance as to the proper way in which we could just not be following our rules versus how we would properly be going about doing that? Isn't there a isn't there a more specific procedure as to how we would have to officially decide not to be following the rules at hand?
Yes. So should someone wish to not follow the rules as laid out in the procedure, that should require a motion to suspend the particular council rule of procedure at play, and then a vote, which would require a majority, to actually suspend the rules. The other way to do it is to go rogue.
Thank you for that, Teresa. I do find it ironic, Matt, that you asked that question without raising your hand or being addressed in this meeting, but I appreciate that.
We all have work to do.
Teresa, with that, so because we typically aren't following some of these, so how does that fit into what you just said?
You know, you've asked the question in a very direct way, and so I'm going to give you a very direct answer, which would be that the council is out of order.
Okay, thank you. I see Tina. Do you have additional questions?
Yeah, so first I'm going to just follow up, then to permanently change the rule about responding to open comment. What's the process for that?
The process for that would be, I think, first an evaluation of staff time and capacity to do so, and then the assent of at least 5 council members. So that would be a formal vote taken, or a nod of 5.
Okay. I mean, can I just weigh in on all 3? Lauren, do you want to try that and then we'll see?
Sure.
Okay. I would like to follow all the rules, and I think for me the hotline doesn't seem too difficult, or the CAC, but staff might need to help us with the hotline so that we know when we're out of order. And with regards to the response of public comment, and for what it's worth, I would also ask Teresa prior to the meeting if we could suspend the rules for a period of 60 days so that we didn't have to take a vote at every meeting. But we can't do that. We have to do it at each meeting. So, and the reason I say this is I struggle with our response to public comment not being after public comment. So to have people provide comment and then have a 3-hour meeting and then say, now I want to respond to this item, I think it's awkward. And I'm not sure it's the right thing to be doing. So I think the way we're doing it makes sense to me, even though I don't always love the whole public comment, but I do think it makes sense. So I would be interested in finding a permanent solution to a rule change. And it might be also that then, unfortunately, there would be a response to public comment at the beginning of the meeting and then a matters section where we would seek the nods of 3 or 5, which opens up 2 sort of public forums, which might add time to meetings. But so this may be something that the process committee looks at or something like that. But I have concerns about sticking indefinitely to the rule that we would respond to public comment at 10 at night. I'm still uncomfortable with that idea.
Thank you, Tina. I see Mark and then Taisha.
With respect to hotline, I am perfectly comfortable, and I'm the one who uses hotline most. If staff wants to say, buddy, that's an unreasonable request, we can address that in a timely fashion, and you need to get a nod of 3 or 5 or whatever. I would leave that to staff's discretion to point that out. If the information cannot be provided or the questions cannot be answered without that commitment of time, I'm okay with that. With respect to answering public comment, I agree with Tina. I am an advocate for a change in the rules that formally permit us to respond after public comment, not 3 hours later. Particularly when some of the public comment we have experienced in recent weeks has been treating us as human piñatas. And when that kind of comment is made, when it becomes personal, when it becomes offensive and derogatory in a major way, I think we are entitled within a brief time period, and whether it's 1 minute or 2 minutes, I'd advocate for 2 minutes thoroughly enforced. But whether it's that or 90 seconds or whatever, I think we have an entitlement to respond to that, because these are very, very disparaging and hostile, derogatory. I mean, they violate every value that we articulate when we start public comment. And it doesn't matter where our particular philosophies are. We've all been beaten about the head and shoulders on this subject. And I don't think there's anything inappropriate when somebody properly exercises their right of free speech for a member of council to exercise his or her right of free speech and articulate a response to that, not at 10:30 at night, but at 6:45 when the public comment is being made. Any other solution to me is simply not fair to members of council. I don't want to get into big fights with people, but sometimes the public commentary is absurd. It's just thoroughly out of bounds. And if we are going to be called out in that fashion, whether as a group or individually, I think we are entitled to articulate a response in the moment. It cannot be free speech for thee and not for me. So I'd be an advocate of changing the rule to accommodate that kind of response. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mark. I will point out, Mark and Tina, I think you still have hands up. Taisha, you're next.
Thank you. I echo agreement for being able to respond immediately thereafter. I also agree with some kind of time limit to Nicole's point around being able to better determine time allocations for the agenda. If we have a time limit in response, it'll very much help us to be able to do that. For the hotline, I really like the idea of like, if somebody puts a hotline, could we, if other council members would also, you know, to get to that nod of 3 or 5, like if we can kind of also respond to say, yes, I would be interested, just to expedite, because I can imagine, I mean, I don't know, I sound, okay, I see that's a no, but my larger point is how can, you know, if it is going to be the 3 and we're getting ready to meet, I have some concerns around the delay in getting that, especially if it's something we have to like vote on. So I'm less concerned if it's like a study session, but if it's something that we need to vote on, then I have just a question about how we could do that in legally. So, and then there was a third, Matt, so I'm so sorry, I'm not an auditory learner. So there was 1, 2, and there were 3 items. What was the third?
CAC was the other one, or CAC requests.
Okay, and that was just to make sure that they were aligned to our priorities?
Yes, or well, it was specifically just to make sure that well, it was more on the sense of making sure that we are being clear that when we're submitting them, we are recognizing what is a council priority and what is not, so that we ourselves have that check of like, hey, this isn't a council priority, so this is going to be in the back of the line, right? We're going to get to council priorities first, and then the thing that's not will get addressed later. And so it's just expectation setting for the person submitting, but also CAC to make sure that everyone's aware what council priorities get priority and what are not are when time allows.
Okay, thank you very much.
And I think specifically for me, the code language says basically what CAC is supposed to do with those requests, which is potentially scheduling them as a discussion matter under council, under matters for council to affirm or not their interest in having this be scheduled for a larger conversation, you know, with the staff time that might
Oh,
take.
then I want that. Thank you for clarifying.
I also see Teresa has comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify why we wouldn't be able to do the assent of multiple council members to a hotline, and that's because it would constitute it would then potentially constitute an open meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And so
no, I understand.
Yeah, so but
what can we do?
It,
yeah.
yeah, so the place we can do it is as staff, if we see that, we can make a CAC request that you all discuss it under matters. And then likewise, you all could make a CAC request to discuss under matters.
Kind of like what Matt did to get this discussion that is happening right now. Okay, Taisha, do you have any other questions? Okay, I see Ryan and then Tara.
Okay, I have a colloquy on what Tina said about the sequencing of public comments, and I'd just like to share a perspective and how I'm 180 degrees from where I started. So I initially felt strongly that we should be keeping responses contiguous with open comment for all of the reasons I heard. And then I realized something, and it starts from me knowing that we collectively want to do more than we have time for. We have seen that at CAC scheduling. We've seen that at most meetings. We saw it in the last item in this meeting. And so I did some quick math. So we have 22 regular meetings next in 2025 per the meeting agenda that Aaron sent out on November 23rd. So if you take off the first hour, 6 to 7, because that's open comment and declarations, and then you say, well, we probably meet until about 10. I'm being a little bit coarse, but just big picture. So 22 hours times 3 hours to do our regular deliberations, 66 hours. I think I think the actual number is probably less, it's probably 60 or less. And if I look on the CAC agenda now, we have a good portion of the first half of the year. We've already taken time out of that number. So if to the extent that we want to do policy and make decisions, it matters not only what those issues are, but how productive we are with our time, which makes me suddenly feel a lot more like I do wish that time wasn't a factor, and I would like to keep the thing contiguous, but I think we are spending a lot of time because it's contiguous. I think partly it's inviting comments because we have it. And I think we all should have an ability to respond. But when you consider the cost of keeping it that way against what we're trying to accomplish throughout the year, I'd rather put it at the end. And I'd suggest even giving it a time limit, say each, 1 or 2 minutes. I think we should all have the right to speak, at each meeting on whatever we want, but give it some thought, make an outline, and, I'd like to try to observe that myself. So I think we should do that. I think we should put it at the end and suggest or even maybe require 1 or 2 minutes.
Thank you, Ryan. Tara, you're next.
Thank you, Ryan. 100%. What I think is happening, in my opinion, is we are treating open comment like it's priority. We take our energy, we put it at the beginning of the meeting. Everybody, not everybody, many of us have our little speeches that we do, and it becomes the meeting. And then we have less energy and less time to do all the things that we're supposed to do. So I agree with Ryan. I think should be pushed back to matters. And also, I think it should be timed 1 to 2 minutes. We ask our constituents to only speak for 1 to 2 minutes. I think we can also speak for just 1 to 2 minutes when it comes to, personally speaking to different comments. And I'm going to agree with Ryan. Well said, Ryan. Thanks.
Thank you, Tara. I see Nicole and then Aaron.
May I colloquy for just a second? Just for clarification, Ryan, are you suggesting that we put the entire open comment at the back or just our responses to open comment at the back?
Thank you, Mark. Sorry, no, I would suggest keeping public comment in the beginning, and then, at the end, each member they can speak to whatever they want, including public comment at the end.
Can I just say one more thing? I'm sorry. So if you think about 9 members, 1 minute each, we're talking about math again, 9 minutes, that's just 1 minute each, that's 9 minutes extra. If we did 2 minutes, it's 18 minutes extra. We went so late last time. It was so frustrating. And the form-based code didn't even happen and we didn't even finish it. And then Nicole and we couldn't even do our little presentation. These were already on the schedule, which should take precedent to what somebody brings up at open comment, which is good, and it's freedom of speech, and I respect it, and I think it's great, but it also isn't it isn't on our list of priorities that we have to get through.
Thank you, Tara. Nicole?
Yeah, I think, as far as the open comment component goes, I probably will still choose to not respond to open comment most of the time, just because to me, it hasn't ever really felt fair that folks who have the time to show up in chambers on a Thursday night get to direct a council conversation and responses from us. There are so many people who can't be there to steer our public time and our time together. I think I would have a slight preference for having the responses at the end of the meeting just for that reason, or we respond individually to the people who come, only because it's hard to have this bump other things that we have scheduled into the meeting at the same time, right? If a majority of folks want, and there are very good reasons for responding to people while they're present and in the room, if that's what a majority of folks would like to do, then I would just ask that we start scheduling that response time in our CAC agendas and have it be predictable. I would also ask that we limit our responses to the same thing that the public has, which is 2 minutes. So I would definitely support those kinds of changes as well. But as long as we can all agree that it is a good idea for us to be able to plan and intentionally use our time and move in that direction, I am generally going to be happy with where this discussion's going. And I just wanted to comment on one other thing, which was in the hotline discussion about kind of staff keeping folks in line. And I think with as long as that's in the letting us know about needing a not of 3 or 5, and when the request rises to that level, I think that's good, but just because we are a self-governing body, right? It really is on us to regulate ourselves and to help each other. And I just hesitate to bring staff too much into that process in any way, because they're not the ones who are supposed to be holding us accountable. That's us.
Thank you, Nicole. Aaron?
Yeah, that was well said, Nicole. You all are making excellent points here tonight. So, and Matt, I appreciate you bringing this up. So I'm going to go touch on each one of these. On the hotline request, I think we're in good shape here, and so I think we're going in the right direction. And I think, Nuri, I think you've heard loud and clear from us that if a request does cross that threshold, that we're very open and want to hear when it's crossed that threshold. And no offense taken, right? Just, oh, FYI, that requires a not of 3. No problem. We'll go see if people want to do a not of 3. So I think that message has been clear. Hopefully, I'm seeing nods from Maria, so good. And then on the CAC, this is a helpful clarification, because in general at CAC, we've tried to be compliant with counselors' requests, but this is helpful kind of re-guidance to say that, well, we do have limited amounts of time. And so counselors have fantastic ideas, important topics that they're interested in, but if we say yes to all of them, we're not going to get through our work plan items. So I appreciate having this refocusing for CAC. I think that'll be helpful. Excuse me, I had something in my throat. And then on the open comment response, I guess my concern here is just how much time it's been taking. And, last meeting, a bunch of us spoke, myself included. I took a few minutes. And as has been commented, we did not get through our major work plan item in the night, I think in a decent amount, because of how long that whole process took. Of course, the long recesses didn't hurt either, which were not our fault. But it's, anyway, it's becoming a time management problem. So I'm hearing good arguments from people about both responding to open comment at the end, or the ability to respond at the moment if there's something really urgent. But I'm willing to work with the will of council on that. But I would say, in terms from a scheduling perspective, we're going to do better if we do it at the end. And so we're going to get more done. Ryan had good math there. So I think that would certainly be helpful from a time perspective. If we did still say, you can talk at the beginning, I would just urge us to have time limits on that, so that it stayed in a limited amount of time, and that we all internally said, okay, I'm only going to speak when it's really compelling, and so that we can generally get through that section relatively quickly and on to the business of the city. So those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that. I would really like to poll these, or at least kind of see if we have a not of 5 around the open comment one, and which way we want to do that. Matt and Mark have already had, and Tina have all had a shake at this, but we can go again. I would just encourage you to be brief.
I just have a follow-up question.
Okay. Yeah, please. I just haven't weighed in on my preference on any of this, so so go ahead.
So I just want to, and I'm fine with the front or the end if we put a time limit on it. But I do have a question then when we go to matters at the end, and we do a 2-minute time limit for any kind of response someone wants to do, but then we also can generally have a free form where we could say, I went to the farmer's market and saw something of interest and wanted to share that this event's happening. Are we putting a time limit on that as well, or just on the response to the open comment? And then matters also will still include nods of 5, but are we talking about should we just keep the scope very narrow to that and not put a time limit on other things council people want to say at that time?
I assume we don't have guidance on this in our code because it's not something that's been contemplated. I would recommend that, as we have only really seen time issues with one of these things, that we only need time limits for one of them.
I just thought we'd make it clear now that we're not putting all sorts of time limits, just so.
Appreciate that. Thank you for that clarification. Matt?
Thank you. Yeah, so I posed this out there, but I didn't state my preferred solution because I was sort of interested in the conversation and dialogue and thoughtfulness that everyone brought forth. You know, I think, as I said, I think hotline's an easy cleanup, but I think it just needed to be put out there so we're all reminded. Similarly with CAC, like that empowers us and empowers the permanent members of CAC to and with the help of staff to move stuff along and get those nods of 3 when needed. I think that'll help us as a group feel like we have a stake in some of those other bigger discussions rather than it just being that body at CAC. So I think that's helpful. With regards to open comment, I think, you know, I think the challenge we run into is kind of this sense of open mic night and wanting to bring some guardrails into that. And so, you know, I see the values of all of them. I just think the status quo is not working. And so I think whatever we do, it's either follow the rules as written or embark on new rules, but whatever we are doing isn't working. So I think that's kind of, I think what we have, that's like the clearest differentiator for us is picking a lane and not defaulting. And so I hope that we can pick one of those new lanes. In terms of my preference, I would only go one of 2 routes. Well, actually, let me ask a clarifying question. Teresa, are we required by law or by charter to provide open comment?
Thanks for that question, Matt. One moment, please. No, you are not. And in fact, some municipalities do not do that. FYI.
So I asked that question because it's not that open comment's a privilege because we're not required to do that. And we offer that privilege for community to give us that input. But that privilege also comes with responsibilities, like any privilege. The responsibility for those that are speaking, but also the responsibility on us to manage that accordingly and not let the tail wag the dog, because it's not a requirement. We have business to take care of, and that business is the priority of that scheduled meeting. And so if we don't have the right rules to allow open comment to run roughshod or interfere with the business of the meeting, then it does not belong in that place. May not belong at all, but it certainly doesn't belong in that place. And so where I'm going to lean into this is to say, look, the priority is the schedule we have. This is not a guaranteed by law that we have to provide open comment, but I like to provide it. And I like that the community has the option to utilize that. And if we want to couple commentary from us on the heels of that comment, then I think it needs to be at the end of the night. Or we let them speak and then we make our comments at the end of the night. But I think the way it is currently structured, I think it's just going to interfere and has with the business that's in front of us. And so I grow concerned of that. Yeah, Teresa.
I apologize. So I misspoke. Our code does provide for open comment. So our code at 231B5 requires that each city board or commission, I would interpret that to be to include the regular body, to hold regular meetings open to the public, ... and provide an opportunity for public comment at the meeting. So
but public comment, is that the word that's used, or is it open comment?
It is public comment.
So I'm not a lawyer, but I don't know what that's actually referring to. Is it the traditional public comment that is part of that we are required to do, or is it the open comment? Sorry, that we don't need to debate that specific piece, but nonetheless, that's a differentiator that's worth discussing at a later date. I come back to my point. I would say it's a good civics lesson. If everyone has to sit through and watch the business of the city, they're all better for it to provide their open comment at the end. Or I'd like to leave it as the rule states currently in our code that the responses are held under matters at the end of the meeting. So it'd be one of those two options for me.
Thank you, Matt. I'm hearing pretty much unanimous support for reaffirming our desire to follow our hotline procedure and our CAC procedure. I am really excited to get hands to see if we are interested in limiting our response to open comment to a time limit and having it potentially either right after or at the end of the meeting. But I will let the hands that are up still make a comment first. So Mark.
Can I ask a clarifying question first? Because
sure.
I don't think the rules that we have are the rules in front of us. What are we going to do with the rules that are in front of us if we decide that we want new rules at some point?
We can work on that when we get there. Mark.
Yeah, I just want to say the following. First, I am very much in agreement with a strict time limit on our responses to comments. Mayor, you have the gavel. You need to bang it with authority. But I want to point out that the delays we suffered last week were not because of our responses to open comment. It was because of the disruptions to our meeting that made us have to adjourn and leave the room. I think there is so much that is going to be lost if at 10:30 at night we are responding to provocative open comments that were made 3 hours before and doing so to an empty room. It will just be us talking to the wall. And my last point is that some of the comments that were made by members of this council last Thursday were extraordinarily eloquent and persuasive. Now transpose those comments to 10:30 at night, speaking to no one, hoping maybe a reporter in the back will put a line or two in the newspaper. And I think the entire context and the entire impact of those responses is eviscerated. And so I don't mind the time limits, but if somebody is doing something in their open comment that is simply offensive. We've had somebody stand in front of us and deny that the Holocaust existed. Would it be appropriate for us to have to wait 3 hours to respond to something of that nature? And then again, talking only to ourselves and not to anyone else? So I am urging us to have the time limit and the discipline imposed upon us for responses, but to be able to do so in the moment when people are actually listening to us, not when they've all gone to bed and left the room. I just don't see that as being a viable way of responding to that kind of personal attack. So again, time limits don't bother me. In fact, I prefer them. We should not be orating for 3, 4, 5 minutes. We need to say our piece and be quiet. But we ought to be able to do it in the moment. Because what we're setting ourselves up for is just theater. Talking to ourselves and talking to the walls. And I don't think that's a useful form of response. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Again, I would really like to wrap this one up, but I see Nicole, Taisha, and Tara.
Taisha was there first.
I'm just saying the same thing. I mean, I'm ready to just vote on it. I mean, I don't feel like.
I think that would be great if we're ready. Nicole, Tara, are you okay with that? Can we just vote on this?
I really wanted to respond to something somebody said.
Are you saying something new, I guess? Is it something new?
I believe that's I believe it is. It's a clarification on something that somebody said, which is the comment that open comment isn't working, or that we may take it away or something like that. The main issue as I see it is not that it's that we aren't allocating time for our responses, which can be unpredictable and varying a lot in frequency and leading it to be very time consuming. And until now, we haven't had an intentional discussion about how we want to use our small amount of time together. So I just wanted to correct that. I don't know that we could say open comment is or is not working. In my mind, this conversation is really just about how we're using our time together and being predictable for CAC and the other things we're trying to fit into our agendas. Thank you.
Okay. Well, then on that note, then I do have something new to add, which is this is also a time for our community to hear directly from us. So, I mean, I'm going to just say there are some community members that actually do go out of their way to be able to get there. They work a full day in order to be able to get there, in order to be able to talk to us. Not all of them have access. Not all of them are on boards and commissions or can come to all the community events and engagement opportunities. They have an opportunity to come on that night, on that day. So I just want to honor that, like, and as somebody who is new to being on the other side, well, when I was on the commission, it was frustrating to be able to go somewhere and then not have somebody talk to you after you've just missed dinner, missed my drop off, missed all of this. And then I talked for a very short amount of time and you just ignore my existence. It's just rude. And I feel like I 100% am down with the time limit, however, and I think it's fine to add, 15 minutes or 10 minutes in response time, as, to Nicole's request around budgeting in the time. I would like to budget in the time. We could even do an average, and if it doesn't work, we can assess it and determine whether or not we want to revisit it. But I would prefer to do it immediately thereafter, and I would prefer a time limit. Thank you. I'm even down for 90 seconds. So
thanks, Taisha. Tara.
The reason why we had what do you call it when you reset recesses was because after I spoke, we had a lot of boos because whatever I said bothered some people, and then we had to leave the room. And then whatever it was either Matt or Aaron said bothered some people, and we had to leave the room. So those recesses are in direct correlation to our comments after open comment. So that's why I'm going to still stand firm that I think that it will be better to do it after the fact. This is a new thing that we're having, this problem. And so, stoking the fires of what is happening to me is having a bad people are being torn apart right now, and it's uncomfortable, and people are scared to come to council with all the yelling. I know people have told me they're not coming anymore. So I feel there's many reasons why we should lower the temperature and push it to afterwards and say our piece afterwards for that very reason. So I'm hoping that you will all reconsider. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Tara. On that note, I would like to see if you are interested in restricting responses to open comment to 2 minutes. I want to see if we have support for the time restriction first to simplify things. 2-minute time restriction. 1, 2, 3. That looks like 9. Okay. Next, because it was brought up first, I'm first going to see if we have, because it is the way the rules are, I want to see if we have support for following our rules as they are in our council handbook and having responses to public comment be at the end of the meeting. Okay, I see 6. So that seems like support for maintaining what our rules are. If someone has an option that they would like me to look at, that seems like it presupposes that there aren't going to be enough support for any other options. for some reason someone wants me to ask that question, let me know. Tara, I see you have your hand up. No, okay. Thank you, everyone. Teresa.
So the time limit will require a change to the rules of procedure. That is a change that I can work on. In the meantime, if the chair wanted to enforce that, the chair could state that intention, and you all could voluntarily comply or not.
Thank you for that, Teresa. Aaron?
Yeah, thanks for that, Teresa. Because, of course, whatever we are deciding here as a body, it's up to me to try to govern during the actual meeting. So I know we all have the best of intentions on this council, and I know that we care for each other and we care for our community. And so I would just ask that kind of we support each other as we maybe have difficult open comment going forward, and we've just affirmed as a body like the approach that we want to take with it. So hopefully we can kind of support each other through the next steps. And in terms of the time limit at the end, I might just, I'm not going to gavel anybody before we have an actual rule, but I might, just mention that, hey, we've expressed an interest in keeping this to 2 minutes. And if we pass an actual rule, then I might be a little more strict about it. But again, just hope that we can work together and support each other. These are not easy times, right?
I appreciate that. Thank you, Aaron. I believe that brings us to our end of our agenda with no other, unless anyone objects. Okay. With no other items on tonight's agenda, I would like to close this meeting at 9:50. Only 30 minutes, 40 minutes overtime. Thank you all, and I hope you have a great night.
Great job, Lauren. Well done.
Yeah. Thanks.